Most of the buildings in Morristown adhered to a style that was popular 100 years ago. The most eye-catching building in the town was the Black Cathedral spire. After settling the carriage, Klein and the others quickly finished their lunch of bread, toast, bacon, butter, and coffee. We can still tolerate about 2 hours and 35 minutes of sealed artifact 3782's purification. Kenley stood at the door of the church and took out a pocket watch from his suit's pocket. I suggest dealing with the suspected haunting incidents first to prevent the situation from getting worse. Then we can return to the church and take turns watching over the sealed artifact to recover. Under normal circumstances, Sequence 9, 8, and 7 Beyonders had to stay far away from the mutated Sun sacred emblem for 2 hours to recover completely, or at least an hour if they were to make a partial recovery. All right, I have no objections. Klein and Leonard spoke in unison. Then which case should we deal with first? Kenley asked. Leonard wiped away his frivolous attitude and said, let's start with the old man living alone who heard heavy footsteps in his house. Why? Kenley asked instinctively. Klein was also interested to hear an explanation. Could this be the intuition of a poet? He mocked Leonard secretly. Leonard shifted his gaze from Kenley's face to Klein's, then looked at Kenley again. He smiled. Because it's the closest to the church. How did you know that? It's not written in the records. Klein asked. Leonard snickered. Didn't I go to the bathroom during our meal? I came across a trainee priest on my way back and had a conversation. He told me that Noah's house was close to the church. Oh yeah, the old man's name is Noah. He sure lives up to his name as an experienced nighthawk when it comes to performing missions. Klein gave a dry laugh. He turned to Kenley and said, then let's go to Noah's house first. All right. Kenley didn't have any objections. They arrived at Noah's house a mere minute later. Noah was an old man with thinning white hair. He had lost his left hand in a war when he was younger and had no choice but to leave the army. He returned to his hometown after he received his compensation. At that moment, he opened the door and looked at the 3 strangers in front of him before looking at Seor, who was rushing over from the cathedral. He said with a raspy voice, come in. I hope that you can solve my problem. I heard that you brought holy water, sacred emblems, a silver dagger, and garlic. This is great. My worries have eased greatly. Please forgive my blabbering. You have to understand the condition of an old man after not being able to sleep peacefully for 2 nights. Oh my goddess. I've been so scared all this time that my head feels like it's in a cloud. Leonard suddenly straightened his back when he entered the house, his eyes surveying the surroundings. After that, Klein felt a cold aura within the room. Those were traces of activity left behind by a ghost. There really was an impure being here. Kenley was the last one to notice as he suppressed his voice. Very weak, Leonard said with a relaxed tone as he retracted his gaze. The Midnight Poet was a job with a relatively high spiritual sensitivity when compared to all the other Sequence 8s in the church's records. Yes. Klein could feel the warmth and purifying energy of sealed artifact 30782 quickly dispelling the sinister aura in the room without any trouble. At this moment, the people of the town had all gathered at Noah's house, all looking curiously at Klein, Leonard, and Kenley. Cough. Leonard cleared his throat and recited, we have the blessings of the goddess. Those impure beings will vanish quickly and won't bring about any more trouble. After that, he shot a look at Klein for him to perform a purification ritual, for everyone to see. Why me? Klein shot a look back. Of course, he didn't know if Leonard understood what his gaze meant. But clearly, Leonard understood. He said softly, you're the expert in rituals. All right, blame me for being the one who volunteered for this mission. Klein tidied his clothes and took out the holy water, sacred emblems, a silver dagger, and garlic from Leonard. He first placed the dark sacred emblem in front of his chest, then peeled the garlic and tossed its cloves one by one to every corner of the house. This is how garlic is used to dispel ghosts. It's different from the descriptions in the newspapers. Will this work? The townsfolk looking at them broke into discussion, curious and excited, as if they were watching a circus. It's useless. I'm just acting. Klein suddenly felt that he had become a clown. He closed his eyes and splashed the holy water onto the ground with the silver dagger. He splashed the water as he walked around the house, reciting an incantation, the Evernight Goddess. The Mother of Secrets. The Lady of Crimson. Empress of Disaster and Horror. Mistress of Calm and Silence. These typical acts of a charlatan shocked everyone present as the townsfolk fell silent. And once people turned silent, it was easy for them to notice something they missed. What a warm feeling. It feels like I'm sunbathing. No, I feel like I'm looking at a pure sky. How magical. Is this the effect of the holy water? They sure live up to their names as priests from St. Selena Cathedral. Praise the lady. The townsfolk discussed in whispers. The looks they gave Klein, Leonard, and Kenley slowly became that of respect. Noah also visibly relaxed, not doubting that the problem had been solved. Sealed Artifact 30782 is doing all the real work here. We don't actually need to do anything to chase the ghosts away, all we need to do is stay here for a minute. It's not tiring or troublesome at all. After Klein purified the sinister aura off every corner of the house, he opened his eyes and put away his silver dagger, drawing the shape of the crimson moon in front of his chest with a serious expression. Praise the lady. Praise the lady, the townsfolk replied devoutly. We still have things to deal with, but we need absolute silence. Leonard smiled as he looked around. The townsfolk, after witnessing something so professional, didn't stay. They receded from Noah's house like a tide following Priest Seor's lead. Even the master of the house had to leave temporarily. I actually wanted to take a nap. Noah pouted as he walked toward the cathedral. Leonard took a step forward and closed the door, then turned towards Klein. Do a divination on the cause of this incident. No problem. Klein also wanted to find out what he could divine. I know Mr. Azik did this, but he seems to be of a rather superior nature. Haha, a person that can live for 1,300 years must be of a superior nature. So my divinations should definitely be affected. Under such circumstances, without the help of the mysterious space above the grey fog, even I'm not sure what revelations I would receive. Klein took out the pen and paper he brought along with him and wrote down a divination statement. The cause of the haunting at Noah's house. He held the piece of paper and walked to a round table. He then took a seat, closed his eyes, and leaned back. Klein suddenly saw a black mausoleum in his blurred, hazy dream world. It was similar to a pyramid, but stood inverted and was almost fully buried. A black fog obscured everything within the ancient mausoleum. Klein snapped awake and opened his eyes. Did you find anything? Kenley asked in concern. Klein thought for a moment and described the revelation he received in his dream without hiding anything. He ended it by saying, the mausoleum was definitely not in the style of the northern continent, I mean the fifth epoch. I'm somewhat of an expert in this field. Leonard nodded, seemingly in thought. That's an inverted pyramid from the southern continent. It represents the entering of the nether realm from the living world. It's a mausoleum that only the so-called descendants of death can erect for themselves, be it in the Balam Empire of the past, or its satellite states such as the Highlands Kingdom. In some sense, it's the symbol of death. Well, the ghosts are definitely related to death. The results of the divination are undoubtedly correct. Ignoring Leonard's mockery, Klein suddenly had an interesting thought. Could Mr. Azik be the descendant of death, or could he have made a transaction with death to obtain such a long life? According to a chapter from the Revelation of Evernight, as well as the internal records of the Nighthawks, death was a malevolent god, once causing a catastrophe in the northern continent at the end of the fourth epoch. Those times were now referred to as the Pale Era. It's said that death fell to the combined efforts of the seven gods. It's impossible to determine when Lamud Castle was built, but it couldn't have been built before the Pale Era. If there was a connection, then there would be something to investigate regarding the person working behind the scenes, lives in the house with the red chimney, and stole the skull of Mr. Azik's child. Of course, this could be an excuse for the northern continent to colonize the southern continent. After all, most of the inhabitants of the southern continent believes in death. The three Nighthawks didn't stay for long since they didn't discover anything. They soon left Noah's house and started dealing with the two other haunting incidents. The same process, the same results. They quickly rid the town of the auras of dead spirits, but didn't manage to find the cause of all the trouble. Along the way, Leonard asked the townsfolk if any strangers had entered the town in the past few days, but received a negative answer. Mr. Azik didn't come? He must have come and left in secret without anyone noticing him. He sure is cautious. When he said that he would be returning to Tingen by Wednesday, did he mean that these spirits would vanish on their own accord today, even if we weren't here to deal with it? Klein thought about it as he returned to the entrance of Morse Cathedral with Leonard and Kenley. They could still last another hour and 45 minutes with the mutated sun sacred emblem. We'll take 1-hour shifts looking after the sealed artifact. Klein suppressed the excitement in his heart. He looked at the color of the sky and said, let's try to head back to Tingen City for dinner. No problem. Leonard glanced at Klein and laughed. But for safety's sake, I suggest that two people look after the sealed artifact while one rests. Klein froze for a moment, his mind churning quickly. He smiled in reply. Sure, but this way, we have to calculate the most logical rotation. Who gets to rest first? Who's next? And who will be last? How much time do we need to recover? And by how much? Well, I think that we have to establish an algorithm with an unknown value in order to establish the best way, then compare it with the effectiveness of having one person look over it at a time. It's even better if we can compare the efficiencies too. Let's first assume that the unknown value is weight. Leonard's green eyes were filled with blankness and fear. If that's the case, let's look after it one at a time. The person looking after it will stay in the cathedral during his shift, as it has a sufficiently large radius. Of course, we'll have to get Priest Seor and the rest to stay somewhere else. The other two will stand guard outside the church and prevent others from coming close. I share the same opinion. Kenley had felt a headache coming on as Klein spoke about the mathematical problem. All right, Klein nodded, looking as though he was forced to do so. If he hadn't been able to convince his partners, then he would have to make a deal with Leonard in secret, giving away some information about himself to get him to leave. But the problem was solved now. Report chapter. Weak light shone through the narrow window from high above, making the interior of Morse Cathedral a little more visible. Klein put his top hat on his knee while he leaned his leg against his cane. He sat quietly on the first row of the left pew and looked at the altar before him. There weren't any statues of the goddess except for a massive dark sacred emblem. Its base was black, with a crimson half-moon that was surrounded by radiant points of light. On the wall behind the sacred emblem, there were a few openings which allowed sunlight to shine in from the outside. They were focused into tiny specks of pure light which combined with the dark surroundings to form a scene that resembled that of a lofty starry night sky. None of the traditional gods ever left behind an actual image. Only their symbols are worshipped and glorified by people. That seems to be a manifestation of the command, do not look directly at God. Klein let his thoughts wander. He wasn't in a hurry to make the flaring sun charms as soon as he got the opportunity to be alone with sealed artifact 30782. He felt that he had to be careful, patient, and had to wait. Within the first 15 minutes, it was possible that Leonard and Kenley would enter at any moment to remind him about points that he should take note of. In this extremely quiet atmosphere, time flew by quickly. Klein suddenly snapped back to his senses as he took out his silver vine leaf pocket watch, flipped it open, and took a glance. 20 minutes have passed. He muttered to himself. He then set his silk top hat and silver-edged black cane by the side. He got up and walked towards a hidden corner near the altar. At first, he faced the side of the altar, but once he saw the large dark sacred emblem and the holy scenery that resembled a depiction of a night sky, he felt guilty and uncomfortable. Hence, he turned his back to the altar. Then, Klein took out the sealed artifact 30782 from the inner pocket of his black tuxedo. He bent down to place the golden unadorned badge on the ground. Klein took a look at the sun symbol that was filled with abstract meanings, then he took out a small candle mixed with sandalwood. He put it right at the bottom of sealed artifact 30782. That was the dualistic ritual that he learned from the eternal blazing sun. He used an item that was closely related to the deity to represent him, while he used the candle to represent himself. He took a deep breath to ease his tense emotions. Klein then took out the items required for the ritual, one after another, including a carving knife, 2 thin gold slices, sun essential oil extracted from the combination of black-rimmed sunflower, golden-rimmed sunflower and white-rimmed sunflower, golden hand-fingered citron powder, and also rosemary powder. After that, Klein adeptly used the silver ritual dagger to guide the flow of spirituality. He guided it to flow around the simple altar and created a shapeless sealed wall. He squatted down, placed the silver dagger down, and extended his right hand. He lit up the candle that represented himself by rubbing his spirituality. Under the flickering dim light, Klein picked up the sun essential oil and dripped a drop onto the flame. With a puff, an illusory fog spread out with the slight scent of sunlight. After burning the fingered citron and rosemary powder, Klein held the carving knife and golden slices. He stood up, took a step back, and then recited in Hermes, the blood of the eternal blazing sun. You are the inextinguishable light, the embodiment of order, the god of deeds, the guardian of businesses. Ellipsis. An extinguishable light, embodiment of order, god of deeds, and guardian of businesses were all parts of eternal blazing sun's honorable titles. If there wasn't the prefix of the blood of the eternal blazing sun, the ritual would require the god's response to proceed. If so, Klein suspected that the eternal blazing sun would recognize him as the disrespectful person that looked at him directly. Then, Leonard and Kenley would only find a pile of black ashes when they entered. Plus, the ritual had to be conducted via ancient Hermes, a ritualistic language that stemmed from nature. Only a language without any protection but had outstanding effects could allow an incantation to sidestep around the eternal blazing sun and point towards the mutated sun sacred emblem. At the same time, as he was stealing the power from a deity, Klein had no way to divine if it would be successful ahead of time. He felt that it would result in him directly dealing with the deity again. So, he could only recite the rest of the incantation with a strained heart. I pray to you. I pray for you to give me strength to complete the flaring sun charm. The blood of the eternal blazing sun, please transfer your strength into my charm. O fingered citron, a herb that belongs to the sun, please bestow your powers to my charm. As the incantation neared completion, Klein suddenly felt something light up before him. The simple gold badge radiated with an intense light, as though the sun had descended onto the land. Klein suddenly found himself enveloped in extreme heat. His hair was heating up rapidly and was almost on the brink of igniting. His feet felt like they were stepping barefoot on yellow sand that had been exposed to the midday sun, and his face and body were greeted with the hot wind blowing from every direction. In that instance, he felt that he needed to do something to let the burning energies out. Otherwise, he would turn into a human candle. It required almost zero thought as Klein lifted both his hands. While his thoughts were boiling over like porridge, he relied on the combination of his spirituality and the strong winds, as well as his instincts and ritualistic guidance, to begin etching symbols, corresponding path numbers, magical characteristics, and ancient incantations onto both sides of the gold slices with his carving knife. Outside the church, Leonard was standing in the shadows to hide from coming into contact with direct sunlight. Suddenly, the sunlight intensified, like the hottest days of a year in early July. He squinted his eyes and looked towards the sky. He saw that the blue sky had no clouds or dust. It was so pure that it made people gasp with admiration. Such strange weather. Beside him, Kenley also noticed the changes in the sunlight. Leonard responded with a smile when he suddenly turned his head. He knitted his eyebrows slightly and cast his gaze towards the cathedral. Luckily Roseanne isn't here. Otherwise, she would be complaining about the sun tanning her skin. Leonard looked away and said with a smile. The blazing sunlight remained intense for a few minutes before it returned to normal. In the cathedral, Klein's carving knife finished the final stroke. As he finished the magical characteristic that represented light, the spirituality on both sides of the gold slices suddenly melded together, as the light converged onto the metal. No, this is even closer to godhood. Klein was finally relieved from the boiling and burning sensations. He examined the two flaring sun charms in his hands with a clear mind. The golden luster on the surface of the charms had turned dim, and the pattern looked ancient yet complex. There was a warm, damp feeling that seeped into Klein's skin bit by bit. Not bad. I finally have a more impressive trump card. Klein sighed emotionally. He set the activation incantation for the flaring sun charms as the word, light, in ancient Hermes. I want light and there will be light. He quipped, amused. Then, he put the flaring sun charms into another pocket. He didn't put them with the slumber, requiem, and dream charms, because the flaring sun charms would decrease their efficacy period. Yes, the power of the flaring sun charms can be maintained for at least a year, or even longer. Klein reined his thoughts back and looked at the mutated sun sacred emblem on the ground. It didn't look any different on the surface, and it still gave off feelings of warmth and purity. Klein finally relaxed, and quickly completed the ritual and removed the spiritual wall. At that point, he thought to examine himself. He realized that his clothes were almost drenched, and he was covered in sweat. The edges of his hair were slightly curly too. Thankfully, Klein sighed in satisfaction. He put away his things and returned to his original seat. He was so exhausted that he slept the moment he sat down, until he was woken up by footsteps. His eyes shot open, and he touched the flaring sun charms subconsciously to see if they were still there. You don't look all right? Leonard asked as he entered the cathedral. Klein massaged his temples, stood up, and smiled. I'm nearing my limit. He took out his silver pocket watch and took a glance. Just in time. It's your turn to look after sealed artifact 30782. Before he finished speaking, Klein took off the mutated sun sacred emblem and passed it to Leonard. Leonard watched Klein walk out of the cathedral. Then, he dropped his frivolous attitude and examined sealed artifact 30782 attentively and seriously. He grew confused and looked bewildered. After the shifts ended, the three Nighthawks began their journey back. Before that, they told Priest Seor to take note of the town's situation. If there were any paranormal incidents, he was to immediately send a telegram to St. Selena Cathedral. At 20 minutes past 7 that night, they finally arrived at Zoutland Street and returned sealed artifact 30782. When he had made sure that the captain didn't notice anything unusual, Klein left the Blackthorn Security Company and arrived home before 8. He took out his keys and opened the door, only to see an unknown figure. It was obviously a maiden who wasn't even in her 20s. She was in an old, grayish-white dress, and she was wiping the dining hall with all her might. She had black hair and brown eyes. Her eyes were small, her nose wasn't sharp enough, and her facial features were very ordinary. Who is this? Klein was stunned at first, then he realized that she was most likely the maidservant that had come for a trial. At that moment, Benson lowered his newspaper and looked at his brother. He smiled and said, "A company that doesn't allow employees to leave the office on time is annoying. But it provides a salary that can counteract any kind of dissatisfaction," Klein replied with a laugh. "When Miss Justice's £300 reach me, I'll inform Benson and Melissa about my raise to £6 a week, that way they would worry less about our family's finances." Klein thought as he put his cane aside and took off his top hat. He walked to the living hall and lowered his voice as he asked, "Have you made a choice?" He had divined the information of the 3 maidservants the day before, and he had found that all 3 were suitable. Hence, the decision was left to his brother and sister. "Yes, Bella. Weekly salary of 5 soldi. She's very willing and also capable of learning cooking. She hopes that she can become a home chef, at which point her weekly pay will double. Her father is a factory worker at the Tingen Steelworks Union Factory, and her mother is a laundry worker," Benson replied with a chuckle. "Of course, another thing that led Melissa and me to the decision is that the other 2 servants believe in the Lord of Storms, and she is a believer of the goddess. I personally don't mind the believers of the Lord of Storms, but Melissa didn't quite like the idea. It wasn't that Melissa didn't like it, a more accurate description would be, I grieve at their misfortune and am infuriated at their refusal to resist." "Yes," it was said by Lu Xuan. Klein recalled his sister's behavior, and revealed a smile. Benson didn't elaborate further. He put down the newspaper and stood up. "Since you're back, let's have dinner." Ellipsis. The next day, Klein entered the Blackthorn Security Company in a good mood. "Good morning." Roseanne looked to the left and then the right. Then, she said, "Old Neil is sick, let's go and visit him at noon." "What say you? Old Neil is sick?" Klein asked in surprise. Could it be that the ritual for treating diarrhea caused severe constipation? Well, from the way he acted after learning of the acting method, it's not impossible for him to suddenly fall sick. He's getting old, so once his mind turns frail, his body would also suffer from those ramifications. Roseanne nodded and said, "Yeah, he sent someone to the captain to request some time off." Klein nodded slightly. "Let's visit him at noon." Sigh, old Neil sure is pitiful. His wife passed away early, and his son is busy in some other city. When he's sick, all he can do is stay at home in loneliness and helplessness. That was the first thing he recalled from his first visit to old Neil's house. Listening to Klein's sigh, Roseanne opened her eyes wide and asked in shock, "When did old Neil get married?" Report chapter. What? Klein was left dumbfounded when he heard Roseanne's question. He recalled in his daze, "I previously visited old Neil's place just last month. I saw a piano in the living room and he told me that his deceased wife loved music." As he spoke, Klein suddenly became alarmed as he began having unpleasant thoughts. Roseanne knitted her beautiful brows and said with uncertainty, "Perhaps I remembered wrong. No, Mrs. Oriana and I frequented old Neil's place during the earlier half of the year. There was no piano in his living room back then. I clearly remember asking him why he chose to remain single. His answer was that he hasn't met a lady that he wished to marry. There was no piano during the earlier half of the year, and he answered the question of why he chose to remain single." Klein tightened up and asked in a deep voice, "Roseanne, how long has it been since you visited old Neil's place?" "Not ever since Kenley became a Nighthawk, and Viola chose to resign as a clerk. I've been either burning the midnight oil or catching up on sleep, so how could I have the time to visit him? It's been, since the beginning of June." Roseanne became a little lost upon receiving the question, so all she did was answer honestly. Klein's heart sank, as if he sensed something was wrong. He fished out a halfpence from his pocket and held it between his thumb and middle finger. He took a deep breath and quickly decided on a divination statement. "There's something wrong with old Neil's current situation. There's something wrong with old Neil's current situation." Ellipsis. His pupils quickly darkened as he recited the statement silently and entered cogitation. Ding! He flicked his thumb, pushing the brass coin into the air and allowing it to spin. Pock! The coin fell right into Klein's open palm. This time, the portrait of George III was facing up. The portrait signified that it was correct, that it was positive. That meant that there really was something wrong with old Neil's current situation. As Klein clenched the coin, he suddenly remembered the translucent pair of cold and ruthless eyes without any brows that he had seen behind old Neil when he had just become a Beyander and was experimenting with his spirit vision. Old Neil had explained that the pair of eyes was a characteristic of ritualistic magic. That's right, I also saw an almost formless human figure by the door at the periphery of the light. The color of its aura was identical to the surrounding darkness. Also, after I completely digested the seer potion, I secretly changed the way I activated my spirit vision to the tapping of my left molar. I happened to look at old Neil and he suddenly coughed violently. Scene after scene appeared in Klein's mind, turning his expression grim. Roseanne looked at him and asked in fear, did old Neil lose control? No way, even though he's petty and stingy, and wants to be reimbursed for all of his expenses, he's still a good person. He rarely gets angry. No way, he wouldn't lose control. I cannot be sure, but I think that old Neil is on the brink of losing control. Klein consoled Roseanne. He quickly made his way past the partition and opened the door to the captain's office. Dunn Smith was startled by the sudden intrusion, nearly choking on his coffee. What happened? He didn't blame Klein, his expression instantly becoming stern. Klein answered simply without hiding anything, Captain, my divination tells me that there's something wrong with old Neil. Last month, old Neil told me that his late wife loved music, but today, Roseanne told me that he's remained single all this time. Also, on the day that I became a Beyander, I saw a pair of mysterious eyes looking over everything behind old Neil. There was also an almost transparent human figure near the door spying on us. He told me that those were characteristics of ritualistic magic. I felt that something was off and, thus, attempted a divination. After Dunn finished listening intently, he stood up immediately. As he walked over to the coat rack, he asked in puzzlement, why didn't you directly divine if old Neil had lost control? Over the past month, old Neil hasn't acted any differently from ordinary Beyonders. He even worked with me to help Swain deal with a mandated Punisher who had lost control. I've also observed the colors of his aura from time to time and noticed that he's relatively healthy other than his frailty that's due to his age. Thus, I think that he's only close to losing control. He could still be saved. Klein explained his point of view in one breath. Dunn put on his black hat and windbreaker before nodding. A very reasonable deduction. Let's go pay a visit to old Neil now, and try not to agitate him if possible. After that, we can attempt to control him and use ritualistic magic to stabilize his condition to prevent it from getting worse. Control? Klein had an idea when he heard this term. Captain, could we use sealed artifact 30611? He had been thinking about how he could resolve old Neil's problem and save him, but he hadn't arrived at an answer as he had been too flustered, too uneasy, and too worried. He was reminded by Dunsmith's words and recalled that the sealed artifact might be useful. Number 0611. Name: Peaceful Hairstrands. Danger grade 3. Considerably dangerous. It has to be used carefully. It can only be applied for operations that require 3 or more people. Security classification: Official Nighthawk member or above. Sealing method: no direct contact with living organisms. Description: a simple decoration formed with many strands of black hair. As long as contact is made with a living being without any protection, the living being would lose all their desires and emotions, including, but not limited to, hunger, anger, grief, pain, envy, jealousy, hate, joy, satisfaction, greed, etc. It has been ascertained that living beings under 611's influence will even lose the desire to break contact with it. They will silently stay in their spot until the end of their life. If an external force is used to break contact between the person and 0611, then the person will gradually recover. But experimental data suggests that the prerequisite to this is that the person has not been in contact with the sealed artifact for more than 2 hours. Once the contact lasts for more than 2 hours, the victim would become silent for eternity. The highest sequence tested is sequence 5. You can avoid contact by means such as wearing gloves. The strands of hair aren't equipped with the capability to live. It doesn't have any inclinations of escaping the seal. Appendix. These strands of hair appeared during a failed advancement. It was something left behind when a captain of the Nighthawks failed to advance to Sequence 6. The great-eyed Dunn nodded after he heard Klein. Great suggestion, I nearly forgot about 30611. Find Royale in the recreation room. I'll retrieve the sealed artifact from Channingsgate and submit the application after we come back. That's the way, no time to waste. Klein didn't dawdle. He immediately went to the recreation room and shouted for the usually expressionless Sleepless Royale. What's the mission? Royale asked calmly. Klein exhaled and said in a serious tone, pay old Neil a visit. Pay old Neil a visit, he? Royale opened her eyes wide as she had an ominous feeling. It's not confirmed yet. Klein shook his head gently. Royale didn't speak any further. They slipped into silence, turning the mood heavy. A few minutes passed, and Dunn finally returned from the basement. He was wearing black gloves and had a tangled mess of black hair in his hand. Compared to the mutated sun-sacred emblem, the peaceful hair strands didn't look particularly weird. It would be glossed over by people if it were tossed on the road somewhere. After calling for the chauffeur Cesare, the four of them made their way to old Neil's house. The wheels of the carriage rolled across the asphalt road that was wet from the rain. The carriage interior was more silent than the night. It was unknown how much time had passed until Dunn sighed. Old Neil did have a partner that he was about to be engaged with when he was younger, but she suddenly became terminally ill. Old Neil risked divulging the secrets of the Beyonders and tried using ritualistic magic to save her, but he didn't succeed. Old Neil back then was just a beginner in mysticism. According to the records, the Nighthawks back then were all on alert, afraid that old Neil would lose control because of this. But luckily, he managed to find his sanity and looked normal. Let's hope that this is a false alarm as well. Klein couldn't help but draw a crimson moon before his chest and prayed, may the goddess watch over him. Dunn and Royale followed suit. May the goddess watch over him. Ellipsis. The sky started to turn brighter as the dark clouds receded. The Nighthawks arrived in front of old Neil's bungalow. After getting Cesare to drive the carriage far away, Dunn collected himself and walked towards the main door, cane in one hand and sealed artifact 30611 in the other. Klein pressed down his hat as he and Royale followed behind the captain. They made their way past the rose and gold mint garden. When they reached the door, Klein took a step forward and pulled on the rope connected to the bell within the building. Clink, clang, a pleasant chime resounded in the house as it broke the heavy silence. Clink, clang, clink, clang. Klein pulled several times, then politely took a step back without making any further attempts. The three Nighthawks waited patiently for a few minutes, but they didn't hear any footsteps approaching the door. Perhaps old Neil went to visit a doctor and isn't at home. Klein forced a smile. He hadn't finished his sentence when a melody came from within the building. It was the music from a piano. It was like a silent lake veiled by a thin mist beneath the moonlight. Dunn's expression became abnormally stern and grave. Klein's heart sank as well. Just as he was about to do another divination, he suddenly saw liquid flowing out from the gap beneath the door. The stream of liquid was transparent and pure at first, before it became dyed crimson, a crimson similar to that of blood. It was an intensely dark crimson red. The color of fresh blood was reflected in Klein's eyes as they intently locked onto the flowing liquid. Just then, there was a light cough from within the house. Old Neil spoke with a raspy voice, Dunn, why are you here? Dunn's gray eyes were extremely deep. His mellow voice replied calmly, I heard that you're sick, so we came to visit. There was a sudden silence in the house. A few seconds later, old Neil roared in anger and terror, no. You're lying. Without waiting for Klein and company to say a word, his tone suddenly became weak. Yes, I know my condition isn't quite right. Old Neil. Klein closed his eyes, but the bloody liquid that was seeping through the gap of the door didn't cease. Then, old Neil raised his voice and said, all this time, I've never hurt anyone, nor have I thought of hurting anyone. I never betrayed the secrets of the Nighthawks, even one. At the most, I've made claims for undeserving expenses. I really haven't committed any evil. Klein, he suddenly shouted like he usually did. I told you about the maxim of the mystery priors, do as you wish, but do no harm. I still live by this saying. I'd rather be patient, I'd rather endure than do things that will harm others. With that said, he pleaded sincerely, in fear, Dunn, Royale, Klein, go back. Go back. Wait till tomorrow, by tomorrow, I'll be back to normal. I swear to the goddess, I wouldn't harm anyone. Really? Dunn closed his eyes and asked extremely gently, "What do you plan on doing? What have you been trying to do all this while?" "Me?" Old Neil was confused at first before he described with a tone filled with hope, "I'm trying to resurrect Celeste." "Dunn, I found a way, I'm on the right track. You should have heard about it. Back then, I made a mistake during the ritualistic magic to treat her illness, so I failed. I failed to save her. I now know it was because I had yet to master mysticism. But now, I now have enough knowledge and experience to complete everything. It's regrettable that I wasn't inspired by the maxim of the mystery priors and Daly's example. I missed the best opportunity. If I was a high-sequence Beyander, all of this would become extremely easy." As he spoke, Old Neil's voice sounded tearful. "No, I cannot give up again. Dunn, go back. Go back, please. I beg of you." Klein clenched his teeth as he heard the captain ask emotionally, "How do you plan on resurrecting Celeste?" Old Neil instantly became very excited. "I'll use the alchemical life method to create an immortal body for her. Dunn, you might not know of it, but Sequence 4 Beyonders from the Church of Mother Earth are good at this. The corresponding sequence in the Savon pathway can barely do it as well. Yes, I will complete it with the aid of God's favor. Then, I'll summon her spirit from the spirit world and pray for God's help to combine her spirit and body together. Isn't it a great idea?" Dunn lifted the corner of his lips forcefully and said, "Yes, it's a great idea. Old Neil, let us in. Perhaps we can help you. Dunn, are you still not willing to let me off the hook?" Old Neil pleaded, "Go back, just go back. I'll return to normal tomorrow, really. Dunn, I swear I'll never steal your coffee beans again. Klein, Royale, I swear I won't make you help me with my undeserved claims. Really." In Klein's and Royale's blurry vision, Dunn lowered his head before lifting it up again. "Old Neil, you're misunderstanding. We're here to visit you. You are our teammate. You're sick, and you aren't well. We definitely needed to visit you. Open the door. Let us see you, so that we can be certain. If you're really okay, we'll return immediately. As you know, there are especially many missions recently. We have to monitor the asylum while we take care of various other sudden incidents." Old Neil hesitated for a moment before saying, "There's really nothing serious about my condition, really. I'll recover by tomorrow." The bloody water that flowed out through the gap under the door went down the stairs, towards the stone path, and onto the garden soil. "Old Neil, we've known each other for about 15 years now, right? We've worked on countless missions together. I'm really concerned and worried for you. I have to see you with my own eyes before I'll be at ease," Dunn said gently. "All right," Old Neil pouted. "There's really nothing wrong with me." With a creak, the door opened slowly. Klein quickly wiped his eyes and allowed his sight to return to normal. Then, he saw that the carpet in the lobby was red and sticky, covered in blood and hair. He looked forward and up, only to realize that the living room's floor, ceiling, round table, piano, and chairs were all covered in the same disgusting, sticky and hairy liquid. Old Neil's head hung in the air, connected to the ceiling by a thick liquid. His forehead and cheeks each had a pair of eyes. They were cold and ruthless eyes with no eyelashes. The piano's keys were dancing on their own, playing a melodious tune. "Dunn, look. I'm really okay," Old Neil said with a radiant smile. "Royale, Klein, you think so too, right?" The moment he opened his mouth, Klein saw the same thick, hairy, and bloody liquid flowing inside it. Dunn's gray eyes shimmered as he chatted like everything was normal. "Old Neil, where did you learn the alchemical life and resurrection ritual from?" Old Neil replied excitedly, "I heard it. I tried the first part, and confirmed its authenticity. It's a gift from God. He kept describing it in my ears. He kept describing, he is. Old Neil's voice came to a halt. More than 10 seconds later, he continued in fear and in apparent loss, "He is the hidden sage." The hidden sage? Isn't that the non-anthropomorphic God that the Moses ascetic order believes in? The God that was resurrected, bringing about evil and corruption. The Moses ascetic order has the complete mystery prior sequence. Klein's heart stirred as many thoughts came to him. Upon mentioning the hidden sage, Old Neil seemed to finally awaken. He looked around vacantly and observed everything. In the indescribable silence, his 6 eyes looked towards Dunn, and he said with a bitter smile, "So it turns out that I've already become a monster." Without waiting for Dunn and the others to reply, Old Neil suddenly revealed a smile, one of groveling, fear, and cowardice. "Let me go. I'll go deep into the mountains and won't appear again. I'll never harm anyone. I'll only attempt my ritual quietly, really. Let me go, please." I beg of you. Just then, Klein felt something illusory shatter before his eyes. Then, old Neil's four cold-looking lashless eyes flashed with a dark glow and locked onto Dunn. His expression suddenly turned cold. You're pulling me into a dream. No, it's useless. My eyes can see through all of that. The sticky blood that covered the ceiling, floor, and walls started squirming, like a giant opening its mouth to swallow Klein and company. Old Neil's head grew blurry like overlapping afterimages. Klein didn't fumble for his revolver. Instead, he extended his hand into his pocket and planned to use his slumber charm. Suddenly, everything calmed down before him. The sticky, bloody liquid suddenly turned placid like a still lake. Old Neil lost his coldness, hatred, desire, and all other expressions. He became quiet and peaceful. It was unknown when Dunn had thrown sealed artifact 30611 into the blood. The four lashless eyes on old Neil's forehead and cheeks slowly closed, seemingly having lost the desire to keep them open. Any living creature that came into contact with the peaceful hair strands would turn peaceful and lose all motivation until the end of their life. Dunn, Klein, and Royale drew their guns at the same time and aimed at old Neil's head. Then, old Neil revealed a look of extreme fear. He was struggling, his strong desire to live fought against the effects of sealed artifact 30611. The four extra eyes disappeared. The wrinkles at the corners of his eyes and mouth were still deep, his hair was still white, his crimson eyes were still turbid, just like when Klein had first met him. Dunn, do you remember the time I saved you? Royale, do you remember when I helped you redeem your family's lives? Klein, do you remember how I taught you mysticism every day? Do you remember when we talked about how to make claims? Do you remember how I made you hand-ground coffee? Do you remember when we fought against a mandated Punisher rampager? The illusory pleading echoed in Klein's ears, and his right hand that was holding the revolver trembled. He found it difficult to pull the trigger. Bang! Bang! The two silver demon hunting bullets flew out and penetrated old Neil's head one after another. Klein watched as the familiar, abnormal face revealed a hopeless expression. He saw the man's skull tear open, the red and white within spurting in all directions. The sticky blood that coated their surroundings started shrinking as it flowed back into old Neil's broken head that had fallen to the ground. Dunn and Royale lowered their guns simultaneously, and all was silent. Klein looked at everything before him. Old Neil's corpse was becoming a ball of rotten flesh. He saw that there was a pair of eyes, crimson and crystal clear, yet incredibly pained amidst the blood and flesh. He felt like everything that had happened was just a dream and found it impossible to bring himself into believing the sequence of events and how it had ended. He stood dumbfounded as he saw Dunn take 2 steps forward, his figure stooped. Dunn looked at old Neil's corpse, and muttered heavily, "We are guardians, but also a bunch of miserable wretches that are constantly fighting against threats and madness." Report chapter. We are guardians, but also a bunch of miserable wretches that are constantly fighting against threats and madness. Dunn's words echoed throughout old Neil's house. They reverberated across the corroded floor, the walls, and ceiling, as well as within Klein's mind and soul. He'd never had a stronger impression of that sentence than the one he had now. He felt that he wouldn't forget this feeling for as long as he lived, even if he were to return to Earth. Amidst the still atmosphere, Dunn walked towards old Neil's corpse, and kneeled down. He took out a white handkerchief from the pocket of his windbreaker and covered it over the dark red, crystalline eyeball which looked pained. At this moment, Klein noticed that the keys of the piano had stopped moving. A faint, translucent figure appeared. This, Klein, who had activated his spirit vision before entering the house, froze. He hadn't noticed this strange soul until now. Was it because he was distracted by old Neil, or was it due to old Neil's abilities after he lost control? Klein saw the formless figure evaporate quickly, vanishing before his very eyes. He had a faint idea of what was going on. Suppressing the heavy feeling in his heart, he heard the captain order, "Search old Neil's house carefully for possible clues." All right. When Klein spoke, it took him a minute to recognize his own voice. His voice was raspy and deep, as if he had the flu. All right, Royale also replied. The condition of her voice is about the same as mine. It's like our nostrils are blocked. Klein looked at his female teammate, who typically didn't have much an expression. It was as if he was knowing her for the first time. Placing his cane on an umbrella rack near the door, he made his way around sealed artifact 30611. He took heavy steps into the living room and up to the second floor. He then searched every room for possible clues. Old Neil employed someone to clean the rooms regularly, so the rooms weren't as messy as one would expect of a bachelor. Everything was in order, as if there was a female presence in the house. Half an hour later, Klein found a few handwritten notes on a bookshelf in old Neil's room. The notes recorded a weird, mysterious ritual. Alchemical life. The materials required include 100 milliliters of spring water from the Spring of Elves, Golden Spring on Sonia Island, 50 grams of star crystal, half a pound of pure gold, 5 grams of phlogiston, 30 grams of red iron, and a large quantity of fresh blood from living people. Old Neil annotated beneath the part about fresh blood from the living. I can consider drawing my own blood, accumulating it little by little and preserve it using ritualistic magic. I can consider drawing my own. Klein closed his eyes and crushed the notes. On Thursday morning at 9, the time of the moon. Raphael Cemetery. Klein was wearing his black formal suit and holding onto his cane. He stood silently in a corner of the cemetery. He had stuffed a neat white handkerchief in his breast pocket and was holding onto a slumber flower. Dunn, Fry, Leonard, and Kenley were carrying a black coffin that stored old Neil's corpse. They slowly walked to the front of the tombstone and silently lowered it into the grave. As she saw the brown soil being tossed into the grave, Roseanne, who was wearing a black dress and a white flower in her hair, wept. Can someone tell me if this is all happening for real? Why did he lose control? Why did he consume the potion? Why did he become a Beyonder? Why must there be wraiths and monsters? Why is there no safer way? Why? Klein silently listened on until old Neil's coffin was completely buried in the soil, until all signs that he existed were buried deep within the earth. May the goddess bless you. He drew a crimson moon in front of his chest, then took a few steps forward and placed the slumber flower in front of the tomb. May the goddess bless you. Dunn, Fry, and the others tapped at their chests in a clockwise fashion. Klein looked up, straightened his back, and saw the black and white photograph on the tombstone. Old Neil was wearing his classic black hat. His white hair was peeking out around the edges. The wrinkles beside his eyes and mouth were deep, his dark red eyes a little turbid. He was so peaceful, no longer feeling grief, pain, or fear. There was an epitaph carved underneath the photograph. It came from the contents of the last entry in old Neil's diary. If I cannot save her, then I shall accompany her. The morning breeze blew gently. The silence and emptiness of the Raphael Cemetery hung over everyone. In the afternoon, Klein took a form signed by the captain to the armory. He opened the half-closed door and saw Brett with a thick, black beard behind the table. Klein froze visibly before handing the form over. 50 rounds of ordinary bullets. During his request, he glanced at the tin can on the table. He felt as though he could smell the fragrance of the hand-ground coffee and hear the cheeky words in his ears, but why must you wait till you have spare cash? You can apply to Dunn and get him to approve of the expenses. Brett noticed Klein's expression and sighed. I can understand what you're feeling right now. I, myself, cannot believe that old Neil would leave us like that. Sometimes, I even feel as though this is a dream conjured by the captain. Perhaps this is the destiny of many Nighthawks, Klein replied with a bitter smile. After this incident, he felt much more disappointment and hatred toward the upper echelons of the church for keeping the acting method a secret. Let's hope that there will be fewer such tragedies. May the goddess bless us. Brett drew a crimson moon in front of his chest. He took the application form and walked into the armory. Bang! 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 The smell of gunpowder filled the air. Klein vented his frustrations onto the target he was shooting at, until he finished shooting the bullets that he had requested. He then collected himself and took a public carriage to Gawain's house. He completed sets upon sets of exercises, as if he was torturing himself, until Gawain told him to stop. Combat practice isn't there for you to harm yourself. Gawain looked at Klein with his turbid green eyes. I'm sorry, teacher. I'm a little down today. Klein exhaled and attempted to explain. What happened? Gawain asked without a ripple of emotion. Klein thought for a moment, then gave a simple reply. A friend of mine passed away suddenly. Gawain was silent for a few seconds. He stroked his blonde mustache and said with a fleeting voice, I once lost 325 friends in the span of 5 minutes, amongst them were 10 that I could trust with my life. Klein sighed in realization. That is the cruelty of war. Gawain shot a glance at him and let out a self-deprecating laugh. The cruelest thing of all is the fact that I can never exact revenge for them. I can never fulfill their dreams, and the answer eludes me forever. As for you, you still have such a chance. Even though I don't exactly know what happened, I know that you're still young. You still have many opportunities. Klein was silent for a moment. He took in a breath and collected himself. Thank you, teacher. Gawain nodded and said without any expression, take a 10-minute break, then do 10 more sets of the exercises you were doing just now. Quote. Klein was momentarily unsure what expression he should show. Friday morning, in the recreation room of the Nighthawks. Klein, Sika Tron, and Fry were seated around the round table, but they weren't playing cards. One of them was flipping through newspapers, the other was looking out the oriel windows in a daze, and the last was holding onto a pen, wanting to write something but failing to do so. The room was quiet. No one spoke, and no one joked around. The atmosphere was heavy. Phew, Klein exhaled. He lowered his newspaper and planned to focus on reading the materials he had found. At that moment, Dunn Smith knocked and entered the room. He looked around before saying, Klein, come out for a moment. What happened? Klein, who had a premonition of what was happening, stood up and made his way out of the recreation room. Dunn stood at the entrance of the stairway leading to the basement. He turned and looked at Klein. The person that the Holy Cathedral sent is here. The person examining me is here? Klein's nerves tensed. There was a cold breeze blowing from the basement, providing a hint of relief for Klein's tense emotions. It's finally here. Once I pass this stage, I won't have to worry about being examined like this for at least half a year. Once I advance to Sequence 8 and become a so-called clown, I'll possess actual combat strength. With the aid of divination and my flaring sun charms for backup, I'll have a chance of surviving even more relatively dangerous situations. Since I was waiting for the Holy Cathedral's examination, I haven't even dared to withdraw the £300 that Miss Justice transferred to the anonymous account. Just in case they audit my financial situation and find out that I'm in possession of a large sum of money from an unknown source. Just as Klein's thoughts flashed through his mind uncontrollably, Dunn Smith smoothed his sleeve and said in a low voice, the person in charge of the examination is one of the 9 high-ranking deacons of the Nighthawks, Crestit Sesamer. The Holy Cathedral attaches great importance to you. A high-ranking deacon? Klein blurted in surprise. In general terms, the 13 archbishops and 9 high-ranking deacons made up the upper echelons of the church. It was said that there was no lack of high-sequence beyonders among them. The 22 ladies and gentlemen were all equal in terms of their rankings. They only followed the orders of the Evernight goddess, and they were only answerable to the Pope. Dunn took a whiff of the cold wind from the basement before nodding faintly. Yes, he's a high-ranking deacon. But you don't have to be nervous. Crestit is only a Sequence 5, and has yet to enter a demigod state. So, you don't have to be too afraid or reverent. Oh, his title in the Beander world is the Goddess's Sword. As he possesses a holy item, his combat strength is similar to a newly advanced Sequence 4 Beander. I just chatted with him. He was very friendly. If I read between the lines, Captain is telling me that he only said what was necessary. He doesn't want me to be nervous and go according to the plan. Klein nodded thoughtfully and asked, where should I meet the high-ranking deacon? The alchemy room where we concoct potions, Dunn replied simply, as a hint of gloominess flashed across his face. The alchemy room where we concoct potions? The laboratory where old Neil made my seer potion? Klein slowly let out a breath and returned to the Nighthawks recreation room and took his outerwear from the clothes rack. He put on the black windbreaker, placed his hands into his pockets, and walked down the winding stairs that connected to the basement. Then, he took a left turn at the cross junction. Very quickly, Klein saw a secret door under the light of the elegant gas lamps that lined the walls. He saw that the long tables in the room had been moved aside to open up a large space in the center of the room. There were 2 classic high-back chairs facing each other with less than a meter in between them. There was a man in his 30s wearing a black windbreaker and a white shirt seated on the chair that was facing the door. His golden brown hair was cut very short, and his blackish-green eyes were as dark as a forest on a moonless night. The collars of his shirt and windbreaker were put up, and his entire chin was hidden within the shadows. Hello, Your Grace. Klein bowed. Crestit Sesamer had his right leg crossed over his left as he leisurely leaned back into his chair. He smiled and replied, Hello, Klein. You may sit over there. He pointed at the high-back chair opposite him. By the side of his leg was a suitcase made of silver. It was about the size of a violin case. It can carry a sword with an appropriate length. Klein walked forward and sat at his appointed seat. Crestit rested his right index finger on his upper lip as he thought for a few seconds. I plan to first examine how well you've mastered your potion. That's not a problem, right? Not at all. Klein shook his head with utmost confidence. Very confident. Crestit smiled, but maintained his previous posture. All he did was intently watch Klein. Klein suddenly felt the light from the surrounding gas lamps vanish, as though they were swallowed by the rich darkness. He suddenly became exhausted, as though his biological clock had struck the time for sleep. But, his mind was extremely tense, making it impossible to relax. It was just like when he was unable to sleep peacefully due to overexhaustion. The silent night filled his surroundings as Klein heard the noise of dripping water from a tap that wasn't closed properly. Then, he heard the conversations in the Blackthorn Security Company and the movement of the wind blowing through the stairway. Besides that, he didn't see anything that he shouldn't see, nor did he hear any noises that he shouldn't be able to hear. Excellent. Crestet's hypnotic voice dispersed the darkness, and the light from the gas lamps inside and outside the alchemy room came into Klein's sight again. Klein suddenly shook off his exhaustion and returned to his previous energetic self. He affected me without me realizing it. Is that what a Sequence 5B Yander is capable of? This is the horror of a high-ranking deacon? He recalled what had happened and felt a little frightened. Crestet Sesimer clasped his hands and put them on his knees. He bent down slightly, and his lips were blocked by his collar. You passed the test. You achieved a level beyond outstanding in your mastery of your potion. I'll need to observe to see if there are any hidden dangers in your mind, to make sure that the potion's remaining spirit hasn't changed your character subconsciously or left some problems behind. You have 3 minutes to prepare. Klein immediately nodded and said, all right. He secretly took a breath and allowed himself to enter cogitation to remove various negative thoughts. Crestet didn't speak again. He took out a silver pocket watch from the inner pocket of his black windbreaker and flipped it open. Then, he attentively watched the second hand move. 3 minutes later, Crestet closed his pocket watch and said with a smile, I'll begin singing. Singing? Klein wore a look of confusion. Before Klein could reply, Crestet started humming a lovely melody. The melody reverberated in the alchemy room and gradually lost its harmony and went out of tune. Squeak. Scratch. Zing. Klein heard the noise akin to the scratching of blackboards with nails, the sound of bubble wrap rubbing against each other, electric drills drilling, and various other annoying noises. The noises intensified and turned more and more chaotic. They made him want to vent his frustrations and cause destruction. But Klein, who frequently experienced the mad ravings and terrifying screams, restrained his urges very quickly. He displayed annoyance, tension, frustration, and insecurity at appropriate times. Being in too perfect of a state would end up being a problem. It was unknown when Crestet Sesimer had stopped singing. The noises in the alchemy room disappeared and room was awash with tranquility and silence. Silence sure is great, Klein exclaimed in his head. Very good, excellent. There are no latent problems in your soul. Of course, if you wanted to beat me up or stuff my mouth with something, that's only normal. Crestet's mouth was blocked by his collar, so Klein could only determine his emotions through his tone. No, I wouldn't dare, Klein admitted honestly. Crestet smiled and said, congratulations, you have passed all the tests. Now it's time for the question and answer session. His green eyes suddenly darkened. His gaze was deep, as though he could see through flesh, and looked directly at the spirit. Go ahead, Klein replied, sitting straight. Crestet maintained his earlier posture and casually asked, you said that your experience in the Divination Club allowed you to quickly master the potion? Yes, Klein answered frankly but didn't describe further. Crestet nodded slightly and said, and you said that your inspiration came from the maxim of the Mystery Priors and also Daly's example? Yes. Klein confirmed this first before explaining in detail. I found out from one of my teammates who was a Mystery Prior that those who abide by the maxim of the Mystery Priors have a lower probability of losing control than normal. After that, I heard that Madame Daly once said that she wanted to be a real spirit medium, and that she is a genius that leveled up to Sequence 7 within 2 years. After noticing both situations, I thought I could give it a try. I attempted to be a real seer and outlined some principles for a seer. The outcome was better than I expected. I mastered the potion very quickly. Your Grace, I'm not sure if you have had a similar experience. When I fully mastered the potion, there was a very special, very magical feeling. Klein described his experience as if he only vaguely understood the acting method. The man he had been when he was on Earth would have been nervous and embarrassed to speak so many half-lies before such a powerful Nighthawk. But ever since he transmigrated to the current world, he had lied so much that he was used to it. He could do it flawlessly. The darkness in Crestet's eyes disappeared, and his gaze returned to normal. He smiled and said, don't worry, it's not an illusion. From his answer, Klein couldn't see any doubt or scrutiny, so he felt at ease. Dunn endorsed your experience. I believe that you really are a genius, with a logical mind and sharp senses, Crestit complimented. He then asked, did you share your experience with your teammates? Of course, Klein admitted frankly. I hope that I can help them lower the risk of losing control. We're teammates, comrades that face danger together. I don't have any reason to hide the truth. But for the same reason, I didn't tell the clerks. Crestit uncrossed his right leg and sat up straight. His thin lips were exposed from the shadow of his collar. He lifted the corner of his lips and said, although you haven't even been with the Nighthawks for 2 months, I believe your understanding towards partners is much better than many others. I plan to share more information with you, but according to the Holy Cathedral's rules, you have to swear to the goddess that you won't reveal the contents of our conversation to anyone that doesn't know about this. That should be fine, right? I passed the test? Klein was delighted. He nodded without hesitation. No problem. Although I won't be able to teach others the acting method, I can let Miss Justice and Mr. Hanged Man do so indirectly. Report chapter. All right, Crestit Sesimer nodded. He leaned forward. Then swear upon the holy artifact. As he was saying this, he bent down to lift the silver suitcase by his foot. Holy artifact? The holy artifact that earned you the title of the goddess's sword? Klein looked at the actions of the deacon curiously. Crestit placed the suitcase on his knees, his dark green eyes instantly turning black. He lifted his hand then pressed down. The cover of the silver suitcase, which resembled a violin case, suddenly dissolved and receded like the tide. At the same time, Klein felt that the light around him was being drawn forward as if it was being absorbed by the suitcase. Apart from the lights from the classic lamps that line the walls, as well as the silver splendor that spiraled within the suitcase, the alchemy room turned pitch dark. The scene looked extremely strange. Paw! With a crisp snapping sound, Crestit Sesimer opened the suitcase, revealing the pure white bone sword that lay within. Yes, a bone sword. The moment Klein saw the sword, he knew instinctively that it was mainly made out of bone. The short sword silently released a pure white glow in the pitch-dark alchemy room, as if it were a moon hanging high in the night sky, or a lighthouse in the middle of a storm. It looked as though the sword had no defects on its surface, but a closer examination would reveal that the surface of the sword was laced with layers of symbols and icons. These mysterious patterns intertwined to form the body of the sword. Klein observed the holy sword, suddenly realizing that he couldn't look away. His vision was being drawn towards the sword as his brown eyes slowly lost their luster. Crestit lifted the suitcase, moving the sword away from its original position. Klein instantly snapped out of his trance and finally freed himself from the nightmare he couldn't escape before. He cast his gaze to the side and asked gravely, Your Grace, do you need me to put my hand on the holy sword? Yes, come over. Crestit's voice was melodious as if he was singing a lullaby. Klein stood up, still looking to the side as he took small steps forward. As it was dark, he couldn't see where the legs of the deacon were, nor his old leather boots. Stop, Crestit spoke calmly. Klein immediately halted and stood on the spot. He took a quick glance at the pure white bone sword through the corner of his eyes before retracting his gaze again, in fear. With that mere glance, he bent down and extended his right hand, accurately placing it atop the holy sword. A cold feeling swept through his skin and into his mind. The distracting thoughts and feelings of worry instantly eased, as if he was sitting on a roof in a noisy village, smelling the scent of the harvest and admiring the starry night sky. Recite after me, Crestit said solemnly. All right, Klein nodded. He then heard the deacon speak in Hermes. O Evernight Goddess, nobler than the stars and more eternal than eternity. I swear to you in my real name and my spirituality. I, Klein, will never reveal the details of the acting method to those who do not know of it from this moment forth. If I go against this, I shall accept any punishment you deem fit. Please witness my oath. Klein collected himself and made the oath in Hermes, following Deacon Sesimer's lead. He had the faint feeling that a connection has been established between him and a faraway being through the pure white bone sword. After retracting his right hand, he drew a crimson moon on his chest. Praise the lady! Praise the lady! Crestit smiled and bowed in response. Immediately, he closed the cover of the suitcase and pressed down heavily with his right hand. The darkness was instantly lit up as the light from the lamp once again filled the entire room. Klein noticed that the black eyes of Deacon Sesimer had regained their usual blackish green. He made his way back to his chair and frowned. He asked in puzzlement, acting method? Crestit cleared his throat. Without answering the question directly, he instead smiled and said, You might feel a little confused and not understand what I'm about to tell you. but I cannot explain why that is so, for that involves the secrets of the church. You will only have the right to know after you become an archbishop or a high-ranking deacon. Klein looked at Sessemer and added inwardly before Sessemer could say it. You will only be permitted to know after you become a core member of the church, such as an archbishop or a high-ranking deacon, Crestot emphasized. Klein nodded sternly. Crestot placed the silver suitcase back beside his foot and crossed his legs. In the long history of time, the church has had generations upon generations of genius beyonders slowly figuring out a way to avoid losing control. And the core to this method is the name of the potion. It's not only critical, it's also the key. After looking at Klein's thoughtful expression, Crestot continued, we have realized that the names of the potions all point to a certain group, and this group has their own approach and operates in unique ways. In simpler terms, there are a set of rules that come with the name of the potion, different rules for different potions. When we follow these rules strictly, the risk of losing control is reduced to a minimum. Similar to my set of seer principles? Klein took the opportunity to ask. This explanation isn't as simple or understandable as the one I gave to Justice and Hanged Man. Klein silently criticized. Yes. Crestot gave an affirmative answer. When we follow the rules of the potion, we become more and more like the group described by the name of the potion. In other words, we are acting as the job that the name of the potion points us toward. That is the acting method. You must remember, the spirituality of every individual is special, unique. Even though the core rules must be followed by the people who consume the same potion, there are always certain variations to the rules that are unique to the individual. Thus, the experiences of others can only serve as a guide. That is a point that I didn't realize. Klein said sincerely, thank you for informing me. I will remember that. Crestot laughed. These are the experiences accumulated over the generations. After using the acting method, we not only gain mastery over the potion, we're also digesting it, just as we would our food. When you truly digest the potion, you will feel a unique, mysterious sensation. Understood? I understand. Digestion, this term is very appropriate. Klein pretended to be deep in thought. After Crestot explained the method in more detail, Klein weighed his words as he asked, Your Grace, since the name of the potion is not only the core, but also the key, then how did the first Beyonders obtain them? I heard that it was recorded on the blasphemy slate? Yes, that is correct, Crestot replied frankly. But the blasphemy slate was inscribed with the ancient names. The names of the potions which we use today were derived in part from divine revelations. Some were also consolidated by the experiences of the Beyonders themselves. Klein nodded slowly. He pursed his lips and asked, Your Grace, since the acting method is so effective, why wouldn't the Church tell every Nighthawk about it? I have said that it is a secret of the Church. You will understand the reason behind it once you become an archbishop or a high-ranking deacon, Crestot answered, unfazed. All right, return upstairs and tell the rest of the Nighthawks to come down one at a time. I have to carry out the final step of the examination. That's to keep Fry and the others from divulging the acting method. Klein thought as he stood up. He then bade farewell, following the Nighthawks' etiquette. He made his way past the corridor and up the stairs, returning to the Blackthorn Security Company. He saw Dunn smoking his pipe near the entrance of the basement. With a smile, Klein took the initiative to say, There shouldn't be any more problems. His Grace wants me to inform Fry and the others to head down for a conversation with him. Yes, that is the last step. That means that there were no problems. Dunn put away his pipe and headed to the recreation room to tell the rest. As he watched Fry and Sika enter the basement, Klein suddenly recalled something. He said in a hurry, Captain, are we going to have to get Royale who's guarding over Channy's gate, and Leonard who's watching over the asylum? Oh, and Kenley, who's on break? Dunn froze and pinched his forehead. I forgot. He paused for a moment, then chortled. But the matter shouldn't be too complicated. One of the advantages of having a high-ranking deacon examine you is that there's no need to send a telegraph to the Holy Cathedral, or engage in a cumbersome exchange of letters. He can make the decision on the spot and hand the formula to the clown potion as well as the main ingredients to you. That's not too bad. Klein couldn't contain his excitement. An hour and a half passed. As Kenley walked out of the alchemy room, his expression full of puzzlement, Klein was once again called downstairs. He met the high-ranking deacon once again, the goddess's sword, Crestot Sessemer, a second time. This time, the golden brown-haired and blackish-green-eyed deacon wasn't seated. He stood there, allowing the breeze in the basement to blow at his black windbreaker. Crestot's collars stood tall, hiding his chin in the shadows. He looked at Klein and smiled. Nighthawk Klein Moretti, I announce in the name of the goddess that you have passed the examination of the Holy Cathedral. Congratulations. With your contributions, you can immediately advance to become a Sequence 8 Beyander. Report Chapter. Phew, I finally passed. I passed it just like that. When Klein heard Crested Sesamir's announcement, he let out a breath of relief despite being mentally prepared for it. It felt surreal, as though it was a dream. He had assumed that the examination would be tougher and lengthier, but when he thought carefully about it, he realized that what had just happened was what should have happened. If he had taken the normal 3 years to digest the seer potion instead of doing it in a month, the examination wouldn't have even been conducted by the Holy Cathedral. The Tingen Nighthawk's captain would have been responsible for it instead. I thought they would investigate my family and friends. Perhaps Sesamir arrived in Tingen 2 days ago and completed that in secret. I also thought that the examination would require me to complete some task. Hey, I was really overthinking it. The goal of the examination is merely to determine the level of digestion for the potion, as well as detect any latent dangers, and see whether I'm aware of the acting method, and if I shared my experience with others. These thoughts flew past Klein's mind. He flashed a sincere smile. Thank you, Your Grace. Praise the lady. Crested nodded gently and said, to advance is to serve the goddess better, so that you can protect our fellow believers better. You must remember this. Trust me, it'll help you fight the temptation of losing control. Temptation. Klein ruminated over the word. Crested sized Klein up with his green eyes and said sternly, the acting method can help you digest the potion and lower the risk of losing control, but it's not the be-all and end-all. To a certain extent, you can even confuse playing the role and your own existence. You know, there are many actors in the theater that develop severe psychological issues. At a certain level, you might really go insane. Remember that you're only acting. The only point of note concluded by the City of Silver is identical to what Deacon Sesamir said. Klein nodded thoughtfully in agreement. In addition, Crested emphasized, not only is losing control related to the potion, it's also closely related to your emotions and mental health. The most important thing for a Beyander is to control yourself. Only then will you be able to withstand the temptations of evil gods and devils, resisting emotions like greed and jealousy, and the erosion of desire. Of course, I don't mean that you should get rid of all your emotions and desires, because that is something that no human or even demigod can do. Yes, perhaps only some special sequences are able to achieve that sort of state. Klein suddenly thought about old Neil. He couldn't help but ask in reply, we must keep our emotions and desires at a reasonable level, and not allowing them to drive us to do something irrational and abnormal? Crested nodded solemnly. Yes. After he answered, there were wrinkles at the corner of his eyes. That's all I wanted to warn you about. Now, I'll pass you the clown potion formula and the relevant ingredients. He bent down and put his silver suitcase on the long table. He then turned around and moved a few steps, blocking Klein's view. When the surrounding lights strangely vanished again, Klein suddenly understood that the formula and ingredients were in the suitcase that stored the holy artifact. It was simply because his gaze was attracted by the pure white bone sword, which was why he didn't notice, or perhaps, he couldn't notice, the other items in the suitcase. After a few minutes, the light of the gas lamps lit up the alchemy room again. Crested picked up his suitcase and moved away, presenting the items on the long table to Klein. Among them, the most eye-catching item was the palm-sized gray goathorn. It looked like a miniature version of a normal goathorn and was crystal clear, swirling with colors. There were faint layers of unique patterns. Next to the goathorn was a blue rose. There were red veins on the petals that connecting them together. It seemed to form a human face with a smile. Ha ha ha, woo woo woo, ha ha ha, woo woo woo. Klein heard illusory laughter and crying diffused with each other, and he saw pieces of gray halos floating in midair. A crystal of the single horn of a matured Hornassus gray mountain goat and a complete stalk of a human-faced rose. The main ingredients of the clown potion. He nodded indiscernibly and took a few steps towards the long table. 80 milliliters of pure water, 5 drops of tornapple juice, 7 grams of black-rimmed sunflower powder, 10 grams of golden cloak grass powder, 3 drops of poison hemlock. Klein looked at the unfurled goatskin parchment and compared the written content with the formula that he had memorized. After he confirmed that there was nothing wrong, he recalled the demonstration old Neil did. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly to collect his emotions. With the apparatus in the alchemy room, he distilled some pure water needed by the potion. In the potion formula, pure water referred to water that was distilled over and over again. Then, he washed a black metal pot and threw in the supplementary ingredients one after another. He was as skillful as back when he had done chemistry experiments in high school. As the Beyonder ingredients hadn't catalyzed just yet, he didn't see any obvious changes in the liquid in the metal pot. At most, he only saw powder floating on the surface of the liquid. When he was done with the preparations, Klein cast his gaze at the two main ingredients and gratefully thought, there's no description of the exact size or weight of the required Grey Mountain Goat's single horn crystal or the human-faced rose. Perhaps a whole horn and a complete rose have no differences, regardless of their weight, allowing them to meet the requirements. Yes, in the world of mysterious Beyonders, this is definitely possible. If so, I don't have to worry about putting in excessive amounts of the main ingredients. After a few seconds, Klein picked up the human-faced rose and threw it into the metal pot. When the strange flower touched the liquid, it immediately produced a sizzling sound. The surrounding illusory laughter became shrill. Ha ha ha, ha ha ha. Klein didn't delay any further as he immediately grabbed the crystalline mountain goathorn and threw it into the metal pot. Poof! The terrifying laughter disappeared all of a sudden, and the surrounding gray halos slowly converged into the metal pot. Klein lowered his head and saw the liquid in the pot was colored in a mix of gold, yellow, and red. However, the three colors remained extremely distinct at their boundaries. There were bubbles churning and fizzing from the liquid, but they failed to escape from the pot and ended up bursting silently. The scene reminded Klein of Sprite, the carbonated drink from his previous incarnation. This actually looks like a delicious drink. A thought popped into his head that aligned with the characteristics of his culture. Suppressing his nervousness, excitement, and anticipation, Klein poured the liquid from the black metal pot into a glass bottle. What shocked him was that there wasn't a single bit of the potion left in the metal pot. It really is a potion that turns people into Beyonders. Klein raised his right hand, and he looked at the beautiful-looking tricolored liquid. Crested Sesamer, who had been silent the entire time, suddenly smiled and said, "Don't worry. At the very least, I didn't notice any problems with the concoction of your potion. I've been waiting here to ensure that no accidents happen after you consume the potion. Don't worry, as long as it isn't anything serious, I should be able to save you." Okay. Klein nodded and placed the clown potion back onto the long table. Then, he took off the silver chain inside his sleeve and let the topaz pendant hang down naturally, a slight distance above the liquid. To Beyonders of any other occupation, pendulum divinations could only divine a yes or no answer. Of course, when there wasn't enough information, the divination wouldn't yield any useful answers at all. When the pendulum didn't spin, it was called a failed divination. As a seer, Klein's pendulum could also vaguely determine the degree of the yes or no answer. Klein's eyes grew dark as he recited, "This potion is harmful. This potion is harmful." Ellipsis. 7 times later, he opened his half-closed eyes and saw the topaz pendant spinning clockwise, but very slowly. Clockwise means a positive response. In other words, it means that the potion is harmful. However, it spins slowly, which means that it's only slightly harmful. Yes, potions can bring about a loss of control, so there's the possibility of harm. A low level of harm means there is nothing wrong with the potion. Klein let out a breath of relief and wound the pendulum on his left wrist before covering it with his sleeve. At that moment, Crested couldn't help but sigh. "You really are a professional seer. I must fully utilize my advantage, but I can't rely on it too much and think that it's all powerful," Klein replied softly and took up the clown potion bottle. "After drinking it, I'll become a Sequence 8 Beyonder." The thought flashed in his mind and Klein didn't hesitate. He raised the bottle, tipped his head, and gulped down the potion. Bitter. So bitter. It sucks, totally. He instantly realized what it meant to look good on the outside, but rotten on the inside. His face had contorted as a result of the potion. He wanted to puke, but he couldn't. Then, Klein realized that his face was flushed red. As for the rest of his body, they were experiencing a similar reaction. He was convinced that he looked like a steamed lobster. As for his spirit and mind, they felt like they had been extracted into a thin needle, fusing with the potion, drop by drop, as it stabbed into each and every one of cells. It was a feeling that needed no microscope to observe his cells. Klein stood there and saw the intruder invade his body's most minute areas. For a few seconds, he felt like a robot that was having its parts and electrical circuits swapped out. After an unknown period of time had passed, his mind reflected his figure, as though he was listening to himself singing through his own ears. Due to this strange projection, Klein discovered that he could precisely control his facial and bodily motions. Meanwhile, his ears buzzed. He heard the murmurs and shouting echoing around him which had not happened in a while. Hornassus? Phlegria? Hornassus? Phlegria? Hornassus? Phlegria? Phew. Klein imagined the layered spherical light and slowly entered a cogitation state. Bit by bit, he escaped from the state of having his spirituality seep out where he had a slight loss of control. At that moment, he knew that he had advanced successfully. He knew that he was a Sequence 8 clown. After the color in Klein's eyes went back to normal, Crested Sesimer said with a laugh, "You can move about and try to get used to the changes in your body. Try to find the core powers that were given to you by the clown potion." Klein nodded. He considered the fact that he might need guidance from the deacon and thus didn't care about his presence. He repeatedly followed what he had been practicing all this time as he took a step forward. He twisted his hips and threw a punch forward, launching a frontal jab. Paw! He heard the crisp sound of his fist breaking the air. The power in the forward thrust exceeded his expectations. In that instant, he felt as though he was sitting in a carriage which had abruptly hit the brakes. He lost his balance and fell forward. Oh no, this is about to become an embarrassing story, just like Leonard's. Klein mused. But at that moment, he noticed that he could still effectively control his muscles, his body, as well as his center of gravity. He simultaneously exerted force with his spine, tendons, and ligaments, instantly adjusting his center of mass and managing to stand firm despite his distorted posture. Well, upon gaining some understanding of this, Klein attempted several other actions. He confirmed that the biggest change in his body was the massive increase in coordination. He would no longer lose his balance unless there were some extenuating circumstances. I feel like a roly-poly tumbler. I can even act in a circus now. It wouldn't be too hard for me to walk on a rope. The clown potion sure lives up to its name. Many thoughts flashed through his mind. Klein once again tested the extent of the improvements to his strength, agility, and speed. I should be around the same level as Teacher Gawain. After I get used to this and go through the specialized training, I'll definitely become more powerful. Also, with my current mastery over my body, it would be easy for me to grasp combat techniques. Klein stopped moving and nodded in thought. According to his plans, he estimated that he would become decent in combat arts only after half a year. But after consuming the clown potion, he felt that it would only take a month, perhaps 2 or 3 weeks, before he could qualify as a policeman that was adept in combat. That was the difference between an average person and a Beyonder. In a sense, the talents of Beyonders were beyond the reach of normal humans. Crested watched silently as the newly advanced clown tried out various actions before completely stopping. He then nodded. It truly is a potion adept in the field of combat. Without waiting for Klein to speak, he asked, "What sounds did you hear just now?" "I heard someone muttering Hornassus." Klein wanted to keep the term Phlegria a secret for the time being. He wanted to observe the reaction of Deacon Sesimer. If he was willing to relay information regarding the Hornassus mountain range and the nation of the Evernight, Klein would then add on, saying that he heard something different again. Crested nodded slightly, skipping over the topic. He reminded Klein, "Remember, a high-sequence Beyonder can influence corresponding low-sequence Beyonders of the same sequence pathway to a certain extent. In a way, some parts of the respective pathways contain the realm of demigods. The murmurings and howls might have been intentionally conveyed to you by them. They might be filled with malicious intent. You must be even more cautious if the sequence pathway belongs to an evil god. I had a chat with Dunn just now. The Nighthawk in your team who lost control recently met with such a situation. Old Neil, the hidden sage." Klein's expression darkened. He nodded solemnly and said, "Your Grace, I will remember this. I will not be tempted by the murmurings or howls. I will not be corrupted by them." At the same time, he thought of something else. Could this be the reason why the Church only provides the pathways for Sleepless and Corpse Collector, while hiding a large number of the other pathways? After all, the Sleepless pathway belongs to the Evernight goddess, and Death, which corresponds to the Corpse Collector pathway, has already fallen. As for why the Church would still offer the Mystery Prior and Seer, it's because these two jobs are of a support type and can fill the shortcomings of the Sequence 9 and 8 pathways for Sleepless and Corpse Collector. Furthermore, they're only at the beginning of the pathway, so the influence they can gather wouldn't be too prominent. But this doesn't explain why they would hide the names and unique traits of the potions, or the lack of information as to what one should take note of when facing them. Klein retracted his thoughts when he saw Crested Sesimer pick up his suitcase to leave. He adopted a curious tone. "Your Grace, I would like to know how to act as a clown." Do I have to go to a circus? Crestit smoothed his tall collar and chuckled. According to our current understanding of philosophy, you just made the mistake of formalism. You need to understand that the name of a potion not only represents a job, it also represents a group of people that share certain traits. For example, we can also describe seers differently. We can call them people who can see fate, yet remain respectful of fate. Of course, as I mentioned before, there are some differences to the rules concluded by each individual even if they consume the same potion. You cannot completely reference the experiences of another person, do you understand? Klein nodded and thought. I think I can understand some of it. I can act as a clown in my daily life, as long as I have grasped its essence? In theory, Crestit answered, being careful about his choice of words. I understand. Klein drew a crimson moon on his chest. Thank you, Your Grace. May the goddess bless you. Just what is the essence of a clown? If I don't take into consideration what a clown represents back on Earth and only think about what it means in this world, a clown is a job that entertains people using ridiculous methods. For example, hilarious get-ups, exaggerated actions, trickster-like performances. The core is that it must be ridiculous, and it must entertain others. It feels a little off. Must I consider it from the perspective of court jesters from ancient times? Klein thought about it silently as he felt at a loss. Crestit looked at him and also drew a crimson moon before his chest. He smiled, revealing the wrinkles at the corner of his eyes. May the goddess bless you too. At that moment, Klein suddenly perceived something, an intuition that felt like a prediction, that Deacon Sesamer would put his left foot forward. He then saw Crestit pick up the silver suitcase and step toward the entrance of the alchemy room with his left foot. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Klein watched as Crestit walked out of the hidden door, his figure vanishing into the corridor. He was dazed for a moment before he felt intense excitement. The Beyonder powers of the clown potion were more powerful than he imagined. He could intuitively predict a person's next course of action. Was the combination of this ability, coupled with his powerful coordination, exceptional agility, and speed, as well as decent strength, considered being good at fighting with artifice? Klein thought about this revelation. So, this can be considered the manifestation of the seer's abilities in Sequence 8, but it's not enough. This pathway must be one that gives a unique ability every time I advance before reaching a high sequence Beyonder. But the intuitions I get are fleeting, so I don't think I can take advantage of them every single time. Of course, this ability is powerful enough as it is. Taking advantage of it once should be enough to turn defeat into victory. Oh right, after I reduce the influence of the negative effects that come with the clown potion, I can try the ritual to summon myself. I nearly forgot about that. Yeah, the captain must have infected me with his awful memory. In the midst of his thoughts, Klein observed himself once again. He wanted to see if the clown potion had brought along any other abilities. According to the confidential records of the Nighthawks, if the potion would allow the person who consumed it to gain mastery over a certain spell, the person would be able to faintly detect what kinds of spells he obtained after advancing as if he was being instilled with knowledge. But I don't sense any of that. In other words, Clown doesn't come with the ability to quickly cast spells, as reported in the confidential records of the Nighthawks. Could the meaning of crafty be that I can now effectively use my expressions and body language to more easily fool people with my lies? Klein stretched his neck while seriously analyzing his current condition. At this moment, he couldn't help but think back to the suited clown he had encountered previously. The clown's peculiar and varied spells had left a deep impression. That member of the Secret Order is probably a Sequence 7 Beyonder. His clown getup was purely to mask his facial features to avoid being placed on a wanted list. It's no wonder that he could hold his own against 2 Sequence 7s and a Sequence 8. If he had deciphered the fact that I wasn't under the influence of sealed artifact 2049 and avoided falling under its control, 10 of me might not have been enough to deal with him. Of course, Clown is not completely devoid of spells. There are still spells like these. Klein walked toward the long table and picked up the piece of paper that the clown formula was written on. His pupils darkened and with a flick of his wrist, he tossed the piece of paper into the air. Paw! It was as if the soft piece of paper had become a dagger, and it pierced itself into the wall of the alchemy room. I can bring a deck of tarot cards with me in the future. They can be used both for divination or as weapons. Klein collected himself and started to pack up the objects left behind from the potion's concoction. After dealing with this and burning the formula for the potion, Klein exhaled and left the alchemy room, closing the secret door behind him. For the time being, he didn't feel like trying to entertain others through ridiculous methods because of what happened to old Neil. He intended to lessen the influence of the potion through cogitation first. Phew, this is going to be a brand new experience again. No matter what happens, I'm no longer just a supporting member. Yes, ever since old Neil passed away, I'm the only one left in the Tingen Nighthawks team that can provide support. The Holy Cathedral will most likely send a mystery prior or a seer to the team. Klein followed the wall lamps, walking down the dark corridor, and calmly made his way up the stairs leading to the Blackthorn Security Company. He then saw the sunlight in the Nighthawks recreation room. The sunlight shone in through the oriel window, sunlight which was pure and warm. Klein turned towards the captain's office and saw that the door was wide open. Dunn Smith was leaning back in his chair, sniffing at his pipe. When Dunn swept his gray eyes at him, he changed his seating posture. You seem to be in good shape, nothing like someone who had just consumed a potion. This might be the advantage of fully digesting a potion before leveling up. Klein closed the door behind him and took a seat. He and Dunn both knew about the acting method, so their oath didn't keep them from talking about the acting method with each other. They could exchange their thoughts about it, but the two of them didn't bring it up with a tacit understanding. They fell silent at the same time after the exchange. Klein thought and asked, "Has His Grace left?" "Yes, as a high-ranking deacon, he has other matters to take care of." Dunn thought for a moment. "Oh, he took the pair of red eyeballs that remained after old Neil died." Klein was shocked and confused. "Why?" Dunn picked up his coffee and took a sip. He answered after a long silence, "We shouldn't lie to ourselves. A rampager is in fact already a monster, and as I told you before, monsters leave behind things that are rich with Beyonder powers after they die. When these relics can't be controlled, they have to be sealed. Yes, that is one of the most common origins of sealed artifacts. According to the Nighthawks' internal rules, the items left behind by rampagers need to be stored elsewhere, so that they won't trigger their partners. A logical rule. Klein nodded heavily. Suddenly, he sharply noticed that the captain had missed out something. So, he asked curiously, what if the item left behind is controllable? Dunn looked at him, his gray eyes were deep like a quiet night. He sighed and said, "You wouldn't want to know the answer." Klein was taken aback before he suddenly realized a possibility. Normal monsters left behind Beyonder ingredients which could be used to make potions. But what of a rampager who turned into a monster? If they left behind controllable items, would those things be used as Beyonder ingredients? Upon realizing that, Klein suddenly felt a strong sense of disgust. He couldn't help but turn his head to retch. Even his sight suddenly grew blurry. This is such a terrifying theory. But it's an answer that's highly likely of being closer to the truth. In that instant, he had a deeper understanding of sayings like, to fight against the abyss, we have to endure the corruption of the abyss, and, we are guardians, but also a bunch of miserable wretches that are constantly fighting against threats and madness. Would this be one of the reasons why the Church hides the acting method? So that they can recycle a certain number of their own members for spare parts? But this will make members of the upper echelons reject the Church. Klein's face clearly reflected his changing expressions. Upon seeing his response, Dunn suddenly laughed. There was a twinkling light in his gray eyes. Think about it on the brighter side of things, you can think of it as our teammates watching over us in a different form. They will be with us forever. After saying that, Dunn lowered his head, picked up his coffee, and brought it to his mouth. After nearly 20 seconds of silence, he lifted his head and said, "And you don't have to worry. As long as we can find sources of Beyonder ingredients, we wouldn't do what you were thinking about. Alright, according to the rules, you'll receive a day off since you just advanced. You can decide whether or not you want to go to your combat training this afternoon, but you have to inform Gawain either way." Klein gently nodded. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his back and said, "Captain, I have finished my lessons on mysticism. I'd like to use my mornings to learn techniques such as tracking and monitoring." He paused and added with a serious expression, "I'd like to fulfill my full duty as a Nighthawk soon." Dunn gave him a piercing look and sighed. "You're tougher than I imagined." "As you wish." "Yes, Captain." Klein suddenly stood up and drew a crimson moon on his chest. After leaving the Blackthorn Security Company, Klein didn't return home to rest, but instead, took the opportunity to take a trackless carriage to Azek's place. Ding dong, ding dong. As the doorbell rang clearly, Azek opened the door in a white shirt and black vest. There was a gold watch chain hanging from his vest pocket. "Don't you need to work?" Azek took a glance at the sky and realized that the sun had yet to climb to its peak. I actually have most of the day off due to some special circumstances, Klein explained vaguely. Azek looked at him and appeared to notice something as he nodded and made way for Klein's entry. At the hallway, Klein set his cane aside, took off his hat, and followed Azek to the living room. The living room was comfortably furnished with a fireplace, rocking chair, couches, and a coffee table. Klein sat at his usual spot. Azek sat down opposite Klein and pointed at the cigars on the coffee table. Do you want one? No. Klein shook his head firmly. Azek didn't attempt to persuade him as he struck a match and lit one of the cigars. At the same time, he asked casually, have you taken care of the matter at Morristown? I have to thank you for that, Klein replied sincerely. At the same time, he secretly lampooned, Mr. Azek, before you lost your memories, you definitely must have left behind quite a sizable wealth for yourself. Otherwise, how could a teacher who isn't even an associate professor be able to enjoy cigars so frequently? As Azek was fiddling with his cigar, Klein brought up a matter. Mr. Azek, I have something to ask you. What is it? Azek replied without lifting his head. Klein paused and organized his words. One of my colleagues lost control and became a monster. I'd like to know if his spirit was contaminated? He wasn't certain if Mr. Azek knew the meaning of losing control, so he prepared an explanation, just in case. Azek stopped what he was doing and lifted his head to look at Klein. He nodded heavily and said, no doubt. You have to be very careful in a situation like that. If he lost control due to the temptation of an evil god or devil, try to avoid contacting his spirit. It might very likely lead to life-threatening danger. I understand. Klein let out a breath of disappointment. When he was at Old Neil's place, he was too emotional and had forgotten to contact Old Neil's spirit. Neither did Dunn Smith remind him at all. Hence, he missed the opportunity entirely. Now that I think of it, Captain didn't forget but intentionally avoided bringing it up. Klein was silent in thought. He didn't dwell on the topic and instead mentioned his previous encounter. Mr. Azek, I tried to divine the origins of Morristown's paranormal incidents. I ended up seeing an upside-down pyramid that extended underground. My teammate told me that it's a symbol of death. Only his descendants would receive such an honor. Azek put down the match and took up the cigar cutter when he suddenly fell into a daze. He was motionless for quite a while. He leaned back into his seat and wore an unusually gloomy expression. After a while, he said in a deep voice, this gives me a very familiar feeling, but I don't seem to be recalling anything. I'm very sorry. Klein sighed sincerely. He had imagined that he could use the revelation obtained from his divination to further jolt Mr. Azek's memories. Azek cut off the cigar cap, shook his head, and smiled bitterly. If it was something that could be recalled easily, I think I would have long found a way to escape my fate. Of course, I have to thank you for your kindness. Thank you for remembering about me this entire time. He thought for a moment before adding, oh, and I'll be leaving Tingen in the near future. Why? Klein asked in surprise. Didn't we say that we were going to find the manipulator behind the scenes, the person who affected my fate, and stole your child's skull? Azek held his cigar and sighed before explaining, the target might have noticed my attention and investigation. He hasn't been taking any action recently, leaving me with no clues. Thus, I'm thinking of leaving Tingen for the time being and going to Backlund. On one hand, I can take the opportunity to search for traces that I left behind before I lost my memories. On the other hand, my absence might let the target lower his guard. That's right. Mr. Azek's last memory loss was around Backlund University. It's a pity that you can't take my place, searching for the Red Chimney House. Klein nodded solemnly and said, I'll pay close attention to this. Once the target takes action and exposes himself, I'll inform you immediately. Mr. Azek, how will I inform you of things in a timely manner? Klein had the idea that if Azek was Death's descendant, or if he was linked to Death in a certain way, his powers would have been something similar to the Corpse Collector sequence. He definitely had a way to call something like Daly's Messenger. In other words, this could confirm if Azek was actually related to Death or a descendant of Death. Azek took a puff of his cigar and thought for nearly 20 seconds. He took out an ornament from his left sleeve. It was an intricate but old copper whistle. There were many unique patterns that filled it with a mysterious aura. This is something that I had with me when I woke up in Backlund. When you blow it, you'll summon a messenger that belongs to me. Azek held the copper whistle as he explained in detail. After so many years, this copper whistle can still be used? This should be a magical item, right? Klein was surprised and delighted that he had indirectly proved that Mr. Azek was related to Death. Isaac gave Klein a glance, then he put the copper whistle to his mouth and demonstrated. His cheeks puffed up as he blew with all his might. Nothing was heard, but Klein felt a sudden gloominess and coldness. He quickly tapped his left molar and saw that there were blurry white bones being thrown up from the ground, one after another, forming a strange fountain. After a few seconds, there was an illusory monster in the living room. Its body was made of white bones, and there were dark flames glowing in its eye sockets. It was almost 4 meters tall, and it towered over Klein, who wasn't even 175 centimeters tall. As he watched its head nearly tear through the ceiling, Klein suddenly had a thought. Mr. Isaac, isn't your messenger a little too exaggerated? Isaac didn't share those thoughts at all. He smiled and said, after you pass the letter to it, blow the whistle again to end the summoning. Then, it'll send the letter to me very quickly, in a secretive manner. After that, Isaac shook his wrist and threw the old copper whistle across the room. Klein extended his right hand and accurately caught it. He found it cold but mild. Thank you, Clown Potion. He breathed a sigh of relief. He wiped the whistle and blew it hard. Silently, the huge messenger fell apart as blurry white bones sank underground. Ellipsis. The Tussock River ran through Backland and harbors that dotted around the area. Alger Wilson wore the long priest robes of the Church of the Lord of Storms as he walked down from the passenger ship slowly. He saw people walking to and fro around the harbor with countless port workers sweating under the sun. It was a bustling yet noisy scene. It's been a while, Backland, Alger muttered to himself. After leaving Isaac's house, Klein took a public carriage back to Daffodil Street. As he opened the door to his house, he suddenly saw a figure sitting in his dining room. Klein instinctively tightened his grip on the cane in his hand, but quickly realized what was going on. It wasn't a thief, but his maid, Bella. Bella was focused on reading a spread-out newspaper on the table. She jumped in shock when she heard the door open, quickly standing up and stammering, I was just done with the tasks for the morning. I was waiting for the water to boil so that I could eat some bread. I'm still not really used to having a maid in the house. Klein mocked himself. He took off his hat and nodded. Reading is a good habit. To be able to persist in reading, despite the busy workload, is something that's encouraged by the goddess. He used the name of the goddess just in case Bella took his compliment as sarcasm. But in reality, only the god of knowledge and wisdom would place this much emphasis on reading. Of course, all of the churches advocate education. Yes, since she's about 18 years old and believes in the goddess, Bella's love for reading must be influenced by her parents. Parents like this would send their daughter to receive an education as long as they can afford it. Even if they cannot afford public schools, there are always the free schools provided by the church. At most, it would just delay her education, thus, Bella isn't illiterate. She can understand words and read the newspaper. Klein thought as he walked into the living room after setting his cane down. He had quite a good impression of Bella. Even though she was a little clumsy and obviously not used to the kitchen, she had shown a willingness to learn. Bella let her hands hang down and said, embarrassed, I didn't have the opportunity to read many newspapers in the past. The landlord didn't let us use old newspapers to clean the walls. I stole a glance at it when I picked up the newspapers just now to clean the coffee table. I thought that it was rather interesting. What a pitiful lady. When I transmigrated, newspapers were the least interesting of things. Klein thought as he lampooned. He smiled and took out the silver pocket watch from his pocket. After looking at the time, he said, as long as you complete your tasks and do them well, you are free to do whatever you want with the rest of your time. You don't need to be too nervous. Of course, if I'm having a chat with Benson and Melissa, it's best that you stay in your room. I will allow you to use the lamp inside and take a few old newspapers with you. Oh, please knock at my door at 1 in the afternoon, then prepare a cup of sea black tea, 2 pieces of soft white bread, a piece of wheat toast, and a small plate of butter for me. In order to celebrate his advancement to Sequence 8, Klein decided to spoil himself slightly. He was going to eat the white bread ahead of Benson, who was planning on having it over the weekend. Well, I'll buy 8 more pounds of bread soon. In the future, we shall make the change in our staple dish, from wheat bread to white bread. As a Sequence 8 Beyander, my weekly pay is definitely going to increase. To think that the captain didn't mention this. He forgot again. Klein froze for a moment and decided to clarify it tomorrow. All right, Bella replied in surprise and joy. Following that, she asked with a little uncertainty, Mr. Klein, do you mean the sea black tea used to entertain guests? She called him by his first name as Moretti could be used to refer to anyone in the family. Yes, that shall be my usual tea in the future. Klein waved his hand and made his way towards the stairs. He suddenly noticed that he was in a decent financial situation after becoming a clown. This was partly because there were no other large expenses for the time being. He only needed to spend 2 solely on transport while he was investigating the houses with red chimneys, and on the materials that he needed to purchase occasionally. Claims could be made for the latter most of the time anyway. Also, there was a sum of £300 in Klein's anonymous bank account. It was important to understand that 1 less than sup greater than 1 less than sup greater than of land in the countryside only cost 5 to 6.5 solely, which was another way of saying that Klein could afford 920 to 1,200 ars of farmland, which was equivalent to 137 to 179 mo less than sup greater than 2 less than sup greater than back on Earth. Furthermore, this sum of money could allow Klein to buy a house on Daffodil Street on a contract for 15 years. If I convert all that money into land, I'll get between £23 and £31 a year in rent. That's not bad, but not necessary for the time being. I'll use that £300 for emergencies. I'll have to find an opportunity to tell Benson and Melissa about my true weekly salary. Klein thought as he entered his room. After locking the door to his room, Klein sat on the edge of his bed and started his cogitation. He wanted to use this method to slowly control the powers seeping out of his potion. He was very careful and very cautious. He had thought of the term, losing control, very lightly until he saw the mandated Punisher who had lost control. Of course, he didn't know that mandated Punisher personally. He also didn't know what had happened to him. He subconsciously thought of him as an anomaly, a rare case. It was just like how an average person would make comments about a murder they saw on the news before forgetting about it entirely. But what happened to old Neil shook Klein greatly. It made him realize very clearly that losing control was always a possibility, always around him. Loss of control might descend upon him in ways he had never thought about. That sure was a bloody lesson. Klein ended his cogitation and muttered to himself as he opened his eyes. He had dreamed of that scene many times in the past few days, jolting awake in the process and finding himself drenched in cold sweat. He wasn't only grieving old Neil's death, but also worried about his future. If he didn't have cogitation to help him sleep, he believed that there would be many sleepless nights in his future. Other than digesting the potion, I also have to try my best to control my emotions and desires. I have to keep them within reasonable levels and not be consumed by them. Klein exhaled and laid down, quickly falling asleep. On the day that old Neil passed away, Dunn's actions and words had touched him greatly. It made him critically assess the responsibilities of a Nighthawk for the first time. It made him want to take up his responsibilities and help his captain and teammates. Thus, he didn't intend to waste his afternoon. He was going to continue his combat lessons. 3 in the afternoon, on a crude training field. The blonde crew cut Gawain creased his brows as he witnessed Klein slowly familiarize himself with the motions, going from the movements of a decent beginner to the movements of an apprentice knight who had been practicing for a good 6 months. All this happened in the short span of 40 minutes. He called for Klein to stop and sized him up. He couldn't help but ask, what happened? Klein had already come up with an excuse. He was prepared to attribute his performance to scientific research when Gawain added, you don't need to answer if it's inconvenient for you to do so. It looks like there was some communication between the police department and Gawain. It makes sense, he has to train Beyonders occasionally, so how could he not know? Klein heaved a sigh of relief. He smiled as he said, Teacher, how long do you think I will need before I can take part in actual combat? Gawain crossed his arms and looked at Klein seriously. He replied with a raspy voice, 2 or 3 days, but that isn't enough. He explained, as if in thought, being able to take part in actual combat isn't the same as being good at fighting. The latter would take another 2 to 3 weeks. Furthermore, you need to gain mastery over weapons that you can bring with you, for example, a cane, whips, daggers, and bayonets. There's still so many to learn? Klein was dumbfounded. Gawain swept his experienced gaze at him. Remember, every drop of sweat you lose here might save your life in the future. Yes, teacher. Klein pumped himself up and answered. On Sunday morning, Klein entered the Blackthorn Security Company and knocked on the door of the captain's office. Dunn Smith looked up as if he was expecting this. I forgot to inform you yesterday. Your position at the police department has risen from probationary inspector to inspector now that you have advanced to sequence 8. I'll get them to issue the appropriate documents and epaulets to you as soon as possible. Your weekly salary will also increase from £6 to £10. The church and the police department will each bear half of your salary. This salary is the level of an experienced Nighthawk. Of course, I mean an experienced Nighthawk at Sequence 9. Ellipsis. Captain, are you following the wrong script? Klein was taken aback as he listened to the captain. His eyebrows relaxed as he smiled. That's more than I imagined. He had imagined that his weekly salary would only increase to £8. Dunn lifted his cup of coffee and took a sip. The increase in salary for Nighthawks is firstly dependent on years of service, second on contribution, and third on the level of your job. The third criterion is often highly correlated with your contributions. Right, without any contributions, even if one were to digest their potion, they would be unable to apply for the formula and materials. Klein nodded while in thought. A weekly salary of £10, coupled with any bonuses, would mean a yearly salary of about £540. Since he didn't need to pay any taxes, this salary was fairly high in the middle income bracket, just lower than desirable occupations such as esteemed lawyers, famous architects, experienced surgeons, and government workers. Even the vice president of the Lowen Kingdom's treasury only makes £700 a year before tax. That's at most £640 after tax, probably lower. According to the newspapers, a decent house in Backland and Hillston only costs about £2,500. With Benson, Melissa, and my current expenditure, we could buy one in 7 or 8 years. To be able to afford a bungalow in the central area of the capital in just 7 or 8 years purely through my own efforts, this salary makes me happy indeed. Klein got up and bade farewell. He quickly walked to the basement and took his shift at Channy's Gate. Before it was 10, he suddenly heard someone approaching Channy's Gate. Soon after, Dunn appeared at the door. There's a case that requires your help. An incident involving Beyonders? Klein instinctively asked. No, a parliamentary representative of this city, Mr. Maynard, was found dead in his house. The Tingen Police Department is under huge pressure and wants us to use a mediumship ritual to help them pinpoint the murderer. Currently, you are the only person on the team who can do that, Dunn explained. Then he added, the Holy Cathedral will send over a mystery prior to our team next week. Actually, it should have been done a long time ago, but you happened to join and chose to be a seer. How long has the Member of Parliament been dead for? Klein asked straightforwardly as he packed up his things. If it was more than 15 minutes, the information that he could obtain would decline considerably. If it was more than an hour, there would be very little left to find. If it was more than a month, contact with the spirit of the dead would most likely fail. Regrettably, the initial autopsy report shows that Mr. Maynard died between 9 and 11 last night. Dunn shook his head and said, you only need to provide assistance and not consider if you can be of use. All right. Klein took his coat and walked out of the duty room with his hat and cane in hand. Dunn Smith took his place at the Channy's Gate guardroom. Theoretically, as a Beyander, as long as one's spirituality was enhanced, things like spirit vision, divination, and ritualistic magic could be learned. Especially for Beyonders from the Sleepless Sequence who were known for their high spirituality. But in actual fact, the differences between the various sequences was vastly obvious. Dunn Smith and Leonard Mitchell had learned spirit vision, but they could only see faint white or light blue in the auras of others. They were unable to precisely differentiate the status of different body parts. Of course, they could definitely see spiritual things with spirit vision, but doing so wasn't as effective as using their spiritual perception. That also led to a problem in which Beyonders at the Sleepless, Midnight Poet, and Nightmare sequences didn't enjoy activating their spirit vision. Similarly, if they were willing to, they could also learn spirit pendulums, dowsing, dream divination, and so on. But their rate of success wasn't something worth noting. It was the same situation with ritualistic magic as well. When the two of them walked past one another, Dunn suddenly said, I forgot to tell you that Inspector Tall is in charge of the case. He's waiting for you at the reception hall in the security company. Remember to change into your new uniform and grab your new documents. Klein wasn't surprised and replied with a smile, new uniform, new documents? The Tingen Police Department sure is efficient. He had just advanced to Sequence 8 the day before. It's because this case is very important, so. Dunn spread his hands and took up Klein's previous spot. Klein walked upstairs, but he wasn't in a hurry to go to the reception hall. He entered the Nighthawk's break room and entered the attached bathroom to relieve himself. There was only a toilet bowl, a water bottle, and a bucket in the duty room. Then, he changed into his police uniform that revealed his promotion to 2 silver stars and put on his peak cap with the 2 crossed swords and a crown. After transferring his flaring sun charm, Azek's copper whistle, his ritual ingredients, and other items, Klein smoothed out his uniform, took his cane, and exited the break room. He passed through the partition and saw Inspector Tall seated in the sofa area. It had been a while since they last met. The tall police officer seemed to have gained some weight, and his stomach was even more outstanding. With his thick mustache and hair, he looked like a brown bear that had just escaped from a circus. "I'm glad to work with you again." When Tall saw that it was a Nighthawk that he knew, he let out a breath of relief. He stood up and extended his bare paw. "No, palm." Klein corrected himself and shook the other person's hand as a polite gesture. "Me too." Tall stole a glance at Klein's two shimmering silver stars shoulder strap and said with envy, "We're at the same rank now, and it hasn't even been a month." At first, Klein wanted to reply solemnly that the danger that we encounter is 10 times worse than yours, but he remembered his identity then, Sequence 8 Clown. "Maybe I can give it a try." Using his spirituality, he looked at the reflection of his facial expression. He lifted the corner of his lips and replied with a smile, "Maybe in another few months, you'll have to call me, sir." "You sure are humorous." Tall chuckled and pointed at the door. "Shall we head out?" "All right." Klein hadn't given up his cane. Now that he had become a clown, the cane was truly a viable weapon. After exiting the Blackthorn Security Company, Klein and Tall walked down side by side, forming a great contrast due to the skinniness and fatness of the two. "I feel like we could even make an audience at the circus laugh," Klein suddenly jested. Tall nodded in absolute agreement and said, "Yes, I feel our vast contrast brings a comedic effect." "Do you know that some circuses are trying to use fat and skinny, tall and short clown combinations in their performances?" "No, actually I meant a beast tamer and a brown bear." Klein, of course, wouldn't make such a rude remark. He went along with it and replied, "It's a pity that there are no fixed circuses in Tingen." "That's right, but we have operas, theaters, and music halls," Inspector Tall replied wistfully. They casually chatted until they got onto the police carriage. Then, Klein redirected the topic back to the case. "Is it confirmed that Mr. Maynard was murdered?" "We can't be certain, but his wife and 2 sons aren't willing to believe the possibility that he died due to a sudden illness. And there was really something wrong at the scene. When Maynard was found, he was naked on the guest room's bed," Tall said as he deliberated. "He sleeps separately from his wife?" Klein leaned back against the carriage wall and mimicked the main character in various detective films. Tall shook his head and said, "No, his wife hasn't been in Tingen recently. She went to Backland to attend a very important social ball. You might not know, but she's the leader of a new party. She's the daughter of someone from the House of Commons. She's still on her way back to Tingen via steam locomotive. She merely used the telegram to express her opinion on this matter. Maynard is also a member of the new party. He's been a Tingen's Member of Parliament for more than 10 years. He intended to run for mayor in next year's election. In other words, his death might be related to this?" Klein asked casually and immediately laughed. "I'm sorry, I'm only supposed to be helping with the autopsy. The rest of the matter is not within my area of concern, you don't have to answer." Tall didn't mind much but sighed. "Autopsy. You're very cautious. As for your guesses, I would only say that there's a possibility. There was a gathering last night at Maynard's place. There were too many guests, and we temporarily can't find any main suspects. Plus, these guests have decent backgrounds, so we have to be very careful. We can't make any mistakes." "I understand." Klein nodded faintly and asked about the details of the scene. Maynard's house was a bungalow located in the Golden Indus borough. It was surrounded by gardens and fields, there was a stable, a fountain, and a broad pathway built from cement. Klein put on his peak hat with its police badge and followed behind Inspector Tall. They passed through the police streamer and entered the double-story house under the gaze of every policeman present. In the living room, there were 2 male and 4 female probationary inspectors who were talking to people individually to gather statements. Klein looked around and saw many gentlemen in tuxedos and a few ladies in glamorous dresses and checkered gauze hats. "They're the guests who spent the night here," Tall explained and led Klein up the stairs to the 2nd floor directly. Along the way, when the police constables who were searching through the room saw the two, they revealed a look of respect without stopping them. Perhaps it was the effect of the inspector epaulets. "This is the guest room where Maynard's corpse was discovered." The brawny Tall stopped by the crimson wooden door. Klein thought and asked, "Which guest was assigned to this guest room?" "Nobody. There are too many guest rooms in the house, so it wasn't used." Tall put on his white gloves and turned the knob of the crimson wooden door. He made the constable who was keeping watch leave temporarily. Then, he nodded at Klein and said, "Inspector Moretti, I'll leave the rest to you. May the goddess bless us, and I hope that we find something." Klein put on his white gloves too and locked the door behind him. He walked to the side of the bed and saw that the crimson bedsheets were abnormally messy. The corpse laying on it was covered with a white cloth. At this point, Klein could be considered to be quite experienced. He pulled away the white cloth without fear and looked at Member of Parliament Maynard. The man was in his 40s. His blonde hair was trimmed short, and his expression was a mixture of pain and happiness. Klein took 2 steps back and took out the ingredients he needed. He quickly finished the setup for the mediumship ritual. As the faint calming fragrance swirled around him, he recited the divination statement that he thought of long ago, the cause of Maynard's death. The cause of Maynard's death. Ellipsis. As he recited the statement, Klein retreated to a nearby high-back chair and sat down slowly. His eyes darkened, then he leaned back and quickly fell into a deep sleep. In the illusory and blurry world, he suddenly saw the gentleman from earlier. With his opened blue eyes, Maynard was laying prostrate above a woman with an outstanding body and fair skin. He was thrusting hard against her body. He first displayed an expression of extreme satisfaction and happiness. Then, he suddenly clutched his chest with his right hand. His expression then grew contorted. "Paw!" As Maynard fell, the image quickly shattered. Klein opened his eyes and woke up from his dream. "I can't believe I can actually watch porn in such a manner." So, Maynard had an affair and died of exhaustion? Klein chuckled and massaged his temples. He took out a pen and paper before doing another ritual. He drew a portrait of the lady he had seen in his dream with the aid of the ritual. Of course, everything below her neck was omitted. It was a woman whose age was hard to tell. She had the mature vibe of a woman in her 30s, but there was a remnant of innocence to her. Her eyes were crystal clear, and she had a delicate look. Klein looked at his work, then put away his ritual ingredients, and dispelled the spirituality wall. He leaned sideways to grab his silver-edged cane. Suddenly, he heard the reverberating sound of someone clearing their throat. He immediately got goosebumps. Klein looked towards the bed and saw Maynard gripping the crimson bedsheets so tightly that the tendons on the backs of his hands were protruding out. With a swoosh, the Member of Parliament who died between 9 and 11 the previous night suddenly sat up. Saliva drooled from the corners of his lips as he opened his vacant eyes wide. Report chapter. Before Klein could come up with any new ideas, he saw the rigid Maynard lift both his hands up. Its body lunged forward to his left amidst the sound of hurtling wind. In the past, his dulled reactions under such sudden, unexpected situations would have made it hard for him to avoid this. Even if he had noticed the attack ahead of time, he would have had to roll away to avoid the fast-moving corpse. But now, Klein could nearly react on instinct. He stomped down with his bright, buttonless leather boots and jumped diagonally onto the high-back chair. As it had only been a day since he advanced, he was still getting used to his power, agility, and speed. He had accidentally leapt too high into the air and landed on the top of the chair's high back. It was a narrow edge. Klein's heart tightened as he quickly controlled his body and adjusted his center of gravity. He wavered for a moment and surprisingly managed to stabilize himself, like a black cat flaunting its balance and poise. As he was wavering, he flailed his left arm, swinging his cane into the zombie's ribs as it pounced forward. The strike caused it to lose its balance as it staggered and fell onto the carpet. Klein was standing on top of the chair as he felt for his revolver by raising his right arm. He attempted to pull it out from the holster so that he could deliver a silver demon-hunting bullet at the zombie in front of him. But in that instant, he suddenly wondered about the aftermath. If he were to blow a hole in Member of Parliament Maynard's corpse, how was he going to explain the cause of death to the deceased's family or members of Parliament who were focusing on the matter? All I did was double-tap his corpse? As he was thinking, Klein reached into the pocket of his police uniform and felt for a triangular plate. The Requiem charm. He quickly made a decision. He took out the silver amulet without hesitation and let out a low shout in Hermes crimson. As the incantation reverberated within the room, the charm started to release a peaceful aura. Klein quickly infused his spirituality into the amulet and tossed it to Zombie Maynard who was struggling to get up. A cold blue fire appeared, enveloping the triangular plate. A serene and gentle black aura spread forth rapidly, eliminating the anxiety and worry of the soul. Zombie Maynard stopped there, his eyes staring blankly at the ground. His saliva dripped onto the carpet. Klein heaved a sigh of relief and planned to take out the materials and set up a ritual to purify the desecrated being. but suddenly, Maynard once again let out a groan, his blank eyes focused on the left pocket of Klein's police uniform again. Shit! Klein leapt from the top of the chair to the ledge of the oriel window. At the same time, he heard the sound of the chair breaking. Klein had no choice but to take out a rectangular silver plate. The slumber charm. It wasn't only living things that could be put into a deep sleep. The dead were in a state of eternal sleep and would only be woken up under unusual circumstances. In certain books on mysticism, there was even such a description regarding zombies. They slumber by the day and wake up in the night. Crimson. Klein once again recited the incantation in Hermes. He intended to disregard the consequences and shoot the corpse with his revolver if that failed again. The problems that came later wouldn't matter if he was dead. As he felt the silver rectangular plate in his palm turn cold, Klein injected his spirituality into it and tossed the charm out. A dark red flame illuminated his eyes as the sound of a light explosion reverberated around the room. A gentle power spread forth, bringing with it a fatigue that affected every living being. Zombie Maynard had just propped himself up using the chair when he wavered. His eyes closed, and he fell on his back with a plop. With what had just happened, Klein didn't dare to relax. He immediately took out the Amantha extract distilled from night vanilla, slumber flower, and chamomile, as well as the bark of the drago tree, and the full moon essence oil made from moon flowers. He quickly set up a sacrificial altar. Right on the heels of that, he sealed the surrounding area with a spirituality wall with the aid of holy night powder, encompassing the altar and the sleeping zombie Maynard. After silently reciting the incantation and lighting 3 corresponding candles, he dripped a few drops of essential oil extract and scattered various powders onto the flames. Klein then took a step back and cautiously looked at zombie Maynard. He then recited in Hermes, "O Evernight Goddess, nobler than the stars and more eternal than eternity. I pray for your loving grace. I pray that you look over your loyal guardian. I pray for the power of the crimson. I pray for the power of sleep and silence. I pray that you purify the unclean being around me." The gentleman once called John Maynard. Ellipsis. Moonflower, a herb that belongs to the red moon, please bestow your powers to my incantation. Slumber flower, a herb that belongs to the red moon, please bestow your powers to my incantation. It was as if a midnight breeze blew within the wall of spirituality. A thin veil of black steam started to billow from zombie Maynard. When everything settled, Klein used his spirit vision and divination to repeatedly confirm that the zombie wouldn't awaken once more. After seeing the results, his worries eased. He ended the ritual and dispelled the wall of spirituality. Why would he suddenly come back to life? Klein stood in front of Maynard, who was on the carpet. He knitted his brows as he looked down at the corpse. To a Beyander with high spiritual sensitivity, there were obvious signs to note if a corpse would come back to life or not, much less Klein, who was a seer. He often had a premonition of similar matters, but what had happened just now completely took him by surprise. Unless there is a more mysterious influence at play. Just like what happened with the suited clown. Klein recalled the scene in his head and faintly sensed the problem. Zombie Maynard had been trying to attack the left pocket of his police uniform. Left pocket? Klein transferred his black cane to his right palm, then reached for the pocket with his left hand. He took out the ancient copper whistle that was inside. It was a copper whistle carved with many mysterious patterns. It was the copper whistle used to summon Azek's messenger. This copper whistle zombified Maynard? That's quite plausible. Even if Mr. Azek isn't a descendant of death, he definitely has a certain connection with death. It's logical that the objects that he carries with him would produce such an effect. Klein nodded in thought. He took out a copper penny and did a quick divination about his conclusion. As he was at the scene of the incident, holding the relevant objects, and had ample information, he quickly got a result. He saw the copper penny fall into his palm, portrait facing up. This means yes. To think that Mr. Azek didn't remind me to be cautious that these things could happen. Well, he's an amnesiac, so it's not uncommon to forget this. Besides, the copper whistle might not have had negative effects when it was on him. There's a high possibility that it was suppressed. I shouldn't take this copper whistle with me when I'm at cemeteries or ancient castles, places that are prone to hauntings. Otherwise, I'll just be finding trouble for myself and crazily court death. Klein silently made a mental note. He then carried the naked Maynard back onto the bed without much effort. Looking at the obvious mark on the corpse left behind by the stroke of the cane, Klein sighed. He covered the corpse with a piece of white cloth and pretended not to notice. I'll leave this problem to the police department to vex over it. Oh, and the 2 charms I used just now can be considered mission-related expenses, so I can get compensated. He thought as he packed up. He then took the portrait and unlocked the door. The door opened with a creak and Klein saw Inspector Tall, who had been guarding outside, not allowing anyone to come near. What happened just now? Tall asked in doubt and worry. He could faintly hear the action going on in the room. Klein smiled and deliberately said with a little exaggeration, Member of Parliament Maynard came back to life and tried to give me a passionate hug. Don't joke like that. Tall looked into the room in exasperation. Why so serious? Klein said, throwing up his hands. Due to an unconfirmed reason, Member of Parliament Maynard became a zombie. Well, the kind of things that would happen in ghost stories. Fortunately, I hadn't left yet, so I used ritualistic magic to purify the desecration, allowing him to return to his eternal slumber. Is this related to his cause of death? Tall asked, his expression stern. I cannot give you an answer to that. I don't even know what the problem is. You should know that in our field, unexplainable things are a common occurrence, Klein said. He then looked at the portrait in his hand. When I was doing the mediumship ritual, I saw the scene of Maynard's death. He was engaging in some activities that should only be done between a husband and wife with this woman. And at the climax of his joy, he clutched his chest where the heart is. You mean that is the cause of his death? Tall gave him a nudge nudge, and, wink wink, look. In theory, yes, but you should wait for the autopsy. Klein handed the portrait over to Inspector Tall. Tall had only glanced at it when he exclaimed, Madame Sharon. Klein looked at him, lost. Is she very famous? Yea, judging from her looks and figure, she should be famous. He lampooned in his heart. Tall looked around and introduced her in a somewhat excited manner. Madame Sharon is the prettiest widow in Tingen City. She's the most sought-after lady in social settings. She was the second wife of Baron Coy, but unfortunately became widowed. She is welcomed by many amongst the nouveau riche merchants and aristocrats, someone who can be invited to banquets by both the Conservative Party and the New Party. It's rumored that she and her stepson, the current Baron Coy, are on friendly terms with many nobles and senior civil servants in Backland. She's a powerful lady. To think that she and Member of Parliament Maynard had such a relationship. Simply put, she's an exceptional socialite. Klein secretly concluded. He turned around and pointed into the room. The next part is not included in my job description. How you interrogate Madame Sharon is none of my business. Also, I hit Member of Parliament Maynard with a cane before the purification. You'll have to deal with it and think of an explanation. What? The bear-like Tall jumped in shock and looked at Klein before looking into the room. With agility that wasn't suited to his body, he dashed in. He pulled back the white cloth that covered the corpse and after examining the body carefully, he heaved a breath of relief. It's better than I imagined. It's not that serious a problem. Maybe I should have drawn my revolver and shot Maynard 5 times with demon hunting bullets. Let's see if you find that serious or not. Klein lampooned inwardly and pointed outside the door. That's all that you need me for, right? No. Tall shouted. Wait a moment. Klein asked, puzzled. Why? Tall explained seriously, we have to prevent any accidents from happening. After we talk to Madame Sharon and get her testimony, I'll send you back to Zoutland Street. If Maynard can resurrect after being dead for 10 hours, what else couldn't happen? What would I do if you leave? Tall added in his head. All right. Klein massaged his temple and said, find a quiet room for me to rest in then. He wasn't feeling his best in every aspect as he had just advanced a day ago. Having just performed multiple ritual ceremonies, used 2 charms, and suffered a non-trivial scare, he needed to enter cogitation to eliminate any problems. Klein was now extremely cautious about losing control. Tall covered the dead body with the white cloth again. He obviously relaxed and replied, no problem. He brought Klein to a guest room that was closer to the sunlit side of the house. He pointed and said, Inspector Moretti, don't worry. No one will disturb you. I'll be paying Madame Sharon a visit first. Klein nodded slightly and watched him walk away. Then, he closed the door and drew the curtains. In the dim and silent bedroom, he slowly walked over to the rocking chair and sat down comfortably. He allowed his body to rock back and forth rhythmically. There were countless spherical phantasmal lights overlapping in his mind. The buzzing sounds in Klein's ears and the throbbing ache in his head slowly vanished, bit by bit. When his situation stabilized, he opened his eyes and looked into the darkness. He outlined a bed, cupboard, and other furniture. Then, he calmly thought about his earlier attempts. There isn't much feedback from a few exaggerated jokes. Maybe I have yet to control the powers of the clown potion, as there are still remnant negative effects. Of course, I can't eliminate the possibility that such acting has little effect. Personally, I'm not quite willing to play the role of a clown. But since I picked the sequence pathway, I can only bite the bullet and continue. Actually, everyone has to act like a clown at one point or another in their lives. I don't have to be so uncomfortable with the idea. I have to quickly understand a clown's core elements. As various thoughts churned in his mind, Klein suddenly took out a brass halfpence. Mostly out of habit, he divined if Maynard's death was due to supernatural influences. Maybe it's an occupational hazard. Klein shook his head and laughed. His eyes grew dark as he recited repeatedly, John Maynard's death was due to supernatural influences. Ellipsis. Ding. He flipped the coin as he slouched into the rocking chair. He watched its brass luster twinkle as it rotated in the air. Pock. The coin fell right into Klein's open palm, revealing the number 1/2 facing up. A negative answer. In other words, there weren't any supernatural influences involved in John Maynard's death. I guess that man died of orgasmic pleasure. The deceased shouldn't be laughed at, so I won't be using an insipid Chinese phrase to mock him. Klein put away his coin and allowed his thoughts to wander before he nearly fell asleep. Knock, knock, knock. Under the slow and rhythmic knocking, Klein tidied his clothing, put on his policeman's peak cap, and walked to the door. Just as his right palm touched the knob, a scene appeared in his mind. The bear-like Inspector Tall was standing outside the door and pulling his collar. His expression looked disturbed and helpless. Klein turned the knob and opened the door leisurely. Inspector Tall appeared before him as he pulled at his collar. Sorry for making you wait so long. We've already found Madame Sharon and obtained her statement. You can return to Zoutland Street. I'm really sorry for taking up your precious time. Klein didn't ask the reason for his current emotions, but he smiled and said, Madame Sharon admitted that she was with Maynard last night. Yes. She said that under the influence of alcohol, she and Maynard didn't manage to control themselves. When she found out that he died of a heart attack, she was very afraid, so she fled the room after she tidied herself up. She then hid in her own guest room. We don't have enough reason to raise charges against her right now, so we had to let her go while restricting some of her freedom. We'll have to wait for the autopsy, Inspector Tall explained in detail. Klein leaned his head sideways and smiled. Who are you explaining this to? Tall shook his head and forced a bitter smile. Oh yeah, I don't have to explain it to you. I'm just frustrated by Madame Maynard, and I started blabbering without realizing it. Maynard's wife is back? Klein asked in response. Yes, unfortunately. There was something abnormal about the steam locomotive. It wasn't late. Tall gave an affirmative answer in a joking manner. Klein didn't ask further but checked if he had all his personal belongings, before following Inspector Tall down the stairs. Why aren't you arresting her? She's a murderer. I want to sue her, and I want to sue all of you for negligence of duty. I'll hire the best lawyer to sue you. Harsh remarks entered Klein's ears, and he looked over subconsciously. He saw a voluptuous and fair middle-aged lady staring angrily across her. Despite having two young men holding her arms, she continued yelling at them. A very trendy regal gown in Backland this year. Having frequently read the magazine, Ladies' Aesthetic, the first thought on Klein's mind was something unrelated to the situation. He then saw a few gentlemen protecting a lady behind them. The lady was in a long black dress with fair smooth skin, waterfall-like brown hair, and brown eyes. She looked as pitiful as a fawn in the woods. It made people want to protect her involuntarily. Madame Sharon. Klein suddenly thought of the porno she had starred in. He quickly lifted his right hand, covered his mouth, and coughed twice. Out of habit, he tapped his left molars twice and observed the people present with spirit vision. There's some sort of problem with Mrs. Maynard's body. The colors of her aura are thinner. From the colors of her emotions, she's definitely feeling anger and hatred, which is consistent with her outward appearance. The color of Madame Sharon's emotions are shaded in blue, which represents rational thinking and calmness. This is totally contrary to her appearance of panic and nervousness. As expected, a socialite ain't no innocent bunny. Her body is very healthy. After examining her, Klein was about to retract his gaze when he suddenly saw Madame Sharon lift her head and steal a glance in his direction. Then, she lowered her head again and put on a trembling, trepid look. If I couldn't see your emotion colors directly, I might have been fooled by your act. You should consider working as an actress. Klein lampooned. He didn't stay any longer and left Maynard's house with Inspector Tall. They took the carriage arranged by the police station and returned to Zoutland Street. After taking over the shift from the captain, he continued to stay on duty at Channey's Gate. He took the opportunity to write a claims application. After an uneventful night, Klein returned upstairs and received the breakfast that he had requested Roseanne to buy for him. "I love this pastry," he complimented. He had already passed her the money for breakfast ahead of time. "Really? I can try it tomorrow then," Roseanne replied happily. The corner of Klein's lip twitched as he focused on his battle with the milk and pastry. At 8:25, he yawned and fought back the urge to fall asleep. He arrived at the nearby shooting club. He had made an appointment with the asylum doctor, Daxter Guderian, a few days back. Bang! 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 In the small shooting range, Klein and Daxter aimed at their own targets and finished their cylinder of bullets. Clink! Clank! Daxter flipped and released the empty shells and examined Klein in interest. "You're much more confident than before." "Of course, I advanced to Sequence 8. I now possess actual combat ability." Klein reflected on his own facial expression and body movements in his head and deliberately acted arrogantly. "Because I only used about a month's time to master the power of my potion completely." Daxter pouted slightly and said, "Although that is something to be proud of, there's no need to say it all the time. Hey, as a spectator, you didn't see through my performance. From the looks of it, a clown has the power to suppress a spectator's ability." Klein smiled at his discovery and asked, "How's Hood Eugen recently? He's gone insane for real." Daxter paused and continued, "I probed him with various methods. He really has gone insane. I'm considering whether to begin medicating him, to see if I can treat him." As a Sequence 7 psychiatrist, he actually pretended to be a mental patient. Even though he was giving treatments to other patients, it doesn't align with the core element of the potion's name. That was an incorrect way of using the acting method. It's no wonder that he went insane. Klein thought and said, "Before he went insane, did you find out who got in contact with him?" Besides the doctors, patients, nurses, and odd job workers in the asylum, there were no outsiders that had contact with him, Daxter confidently replied. Klein briefly acknowledged that as he said, "How about even earlier? Is there anyone that visited him, or did he leave the asylum regularly for a period of time?" In order to follow through with his initial promise, Klein never asked anything about Hood Eugen in his first few meetings. Daxter fell into deep thought. It took him some time before he said, "Besides the members of the Psychology Alchemists, there weren't any more than 5 people that visited him. One of them came thrice. His name was L." Without Klein asking, he continued, "But I heard from Hood Eugen that L was a pseudonym. His real name was Lenivus." Report chapter. Lenivus? That criminal who cheated both money and sex? To think that he had a connection to Hood Eugen from the Psychology Alchemists. Klein froze for a moment when he heard the name. He immediately thought about the implications the name, Lenivus, had. He's the cheat that escaped with more than £10,000. Just providing a clue would earn me £10. And if I help in capturing this moving treasury, I'll earn £100. He's a scum that took advantage of the bodies and feelings of innocent women. To think that he knows Hood Eugen and went to visit him 3 times at the mental asylum. Does this mean that he's connected to the Beyonder Circle, or that he's a Beyonder himself? Klein suddenly recalled the name of a potion, the Marauder Pathway Sequence 8, Swindler. These Beyonders took pleasure in swindling others. It's very possible. Klein nodded in thought. He controlled his facial expression and body language, feigning nonchalance as he asked, "Then, when was Mr. Lenivus's last visit to Hood Eugen?" "Early July. I would have to check the registration records of the mental asylum to give you a specific date," Daxter Guderian replied after a few seconds of thought. Lenivus's scam hadn't been exposed back in early July and he hadn't left Tingen. Klein then asked, "Does Hood Eugen mention this person usually?" "No. You should understand that a Sequence 7 psychiatrist would never reveal something by accident. Every word they say has been deliberated over thoroughly. It would be impossible to learn their secrets unless they have some other hidden motives. I was only able to get the telepathos formula after Hood Eugen went mad." "Oh right, have you determined the authenticity of the formula?" Daxter expertly hid his feelings of pride toward his Pathways potion. Klein laughed and replied, "It's authentic. When you need to advance, you can use that to concoct your potion without worry. We can help if the Psychology Alchemists are unable to provide you with the ingredients. Also, how have you been lately?" "Not too bad. Other than being a little worried about Hood Eugen's condition, I feel rather relaxed. I no longer have symptoms of a split personality. You've helped me greatly in this regard, Daxter Guderian said, full of emotion. Klein wore a humble expression. It's only right. Let's return to the topic at hand. Since you said that a psychiatrist would deliberate over their every word before uttering it and wouldn't easily reveal their secrets, why did Hood Eugen tell you that L is Lenivus? Was he hinting at something, or was trying to warn you of anything? Daxter froze for a moment, then creased his brows. This is really weird, to think that I didn't notice this. Other than that, Hood Eugen didn't mention anything else. Could his motive be for me to tell the upper echelons of the association about the name Lenivus should he meet with any problems? The association's reaction seemed strange, too. After I informed them about Hood Eugen's insanity, they did send a liaison. But after I described every detail, including Lenivus's name, there were no more replies from the upper echelons. It was like being a stone cast in the ocean. Could this mean that they've figured something out? A reasonable deduction. Klein took out his demon-hunting bullets and stuffed them into his revolver, then took aim at the target. If we follow this deduction, Hood Eugen might have long anticipated that he would become insane or die. And this has an untenable connection with Lenivus? But since he already anticipated it, why didn't he ask for help from the upper echelons? Daxter gazed blankly ahead. He thought hard as he said, unfortunately, he's insane now. There's no way to effectively communicate with him now. Perhaps some kind of temptation made him choose to take the risk. Klein made a guess. At the same time, he felt that it was regrettable that Hood Eugen had really become a mental patient. This compromised much of the information that he might have otherwise gotten. Sigh. Even a dead person is better than a lunatic. I can use mediumship rituals to make the dead talk, but what can I do with a lunatic? Oh right, Madame Daly once tried to use mediumship rituals to call upon my lost memories. The theory behind the mediumship rituals seems to have been derived from the psychology alchemists. This means that I can also use the mediumship rituals on the living and create a scenario where I interact with his spirit directly using my spirit. I wonder if Hood Eugen would still be insane under those conditions. Unfortunately, I'm not advanced enough in this field, so I don't think I would be able to do it. I'll call upon the messenger and ask Madame Daly about it first. I'll see if she can provide me with any techniques. If she thinks that only she can accomplish it, then I'll tell the captain and get him to send a telegraph to Backlund to request for assistance. I'm definitely not taking this troublesome course of action just because I want to learn the technique and attempt the ritual to summon the messenger. Many thoughts ran through Klein's mind before he gradually narrowed it down to a single line of thought that could solve the problem. Daxter Guderian approved of his guess. Greed always makes one foolish. Even when a person knows that there's only the abyss in front of him, he'll still attempt to walk to the edge and take a peek. This is called crazily testing the limits of fate. Klein lampooned. Try your best to treat Hood Eugen after returning to the mental asylum. Try to keep him sober for a period of time and get some clues out of him. Also, don't hide your worries and anxiety. Establish more connections with the psychology alchemists and put pressure on them to solve Hood Eugen's problem. That's the most normal and reasonable reaction. Daxter nodded seriously. I'll try my best. Klein didn't say any more and, after some deliberation, he asked, has there been any abnormalities with Hood Eugen's body recently? For example, thin scales growing on some parts of his body? Near insanity, true insanity, and losing control were all descriptions of varying levels for a Beyander when something was wrong with them. The least severe of the conditions were when their attitude changed as if they had become a new person, but were still capable of rational thoughts and actions. That was near insanity. Insanity was more severe in that the person would lose all logic, becoming a maniac and was difficult to communicate with. Those that couldn't be saved were those whose body and mind had become monsters, completely losing control. Sometimes, if the problem wasn't dealt with promptly, insanity would lead to losing control. Before this, to avoid exposing the informant within the psychology alchemists, Dunn instructed the Nighthawks not to immediately deal with Hood Eugen. Instead, they switched to surveillance to ensure that Hood Eugen didn't lose control. But if there were signs of him losing control, they would have to deal with him immediately. Daxter shook his head and let out a bitter laugh. No, you can ease your concern. I'm also very afraid that Hood Eugen will lose control, so I'm paying very close attention to detail. After all, I'm at the mental asylum 6 times a week. After exchanging a few more words, they left the shooting range 10 minutes apart. Klein fought back his intense desire to sleep and took a public carriage back to Daffodil Street. He opened the door and saw his sister sitting on the sofa. She was neither reading nor was she fiddling with machinery parts. She was just staring blankly ahead as if she had lost her soul. Tapping his molars gently, Klein activated his spirit vision and asked, puzzled, Melissa, did something happen? She looks healthy based on the colors of her aura, not malnourished like she was before. Melissa retracted her gaze and pursed her lips, then looked at the kitchen which was producing some noise. Bella has been recommending the way that her family prepares breakfast back at home. She said that it's very delicious. I agreed to let her try it out this morning. What method is that? Klein had an ominous feeling. Cooking all of the leftovers in a pot, then adding water and bread. Melissa repeated softly. This is the standard recipe for food of unknown origins. Klein pinched his forehead. And so? We shouldn't waste food. Melissa bit her lips and nodded. Sis, I feel like you are questioning life. Klein cleared his throat and suppressed his desire to laugh. He then asked, where's Benson? In the bathroom. Melissa broke free of her daze, as her eyes regained their luster. At that moment, he heard the sounds of flushing from the bathroom. Benson came out with a newspaper in hand. My dear Klein, shall we get you a portion of breakfast? No, I've already eaten. Klein shook his head resolutely, feeling lucky that he arranged to meet Daxter in the morning. Otherwise, he wouldn't have gotten Roseanne to buy breakfast for him. How regrettable. Otherwise, you would change your views on my culinary skills and be filled with confidence about it. Benson let out a self-deprecating laugh. At this moment, Melissa noticed something. She turned to look at Klein and said, you're back rather late today. Sis, be more innocent and lively. Don't worry about me all the time. The state you were in just now was great. Klein immediately smiled. I have good news. You passed the examination of the police department and can obtain an increased salary? Melissa asked without thinking. Benson also smiled and nodded. Klein grabbed his hat and stood at the edge of the living room. He said in amusement, how am I supposed to surprise you guys like that? After that, he added with a dry cough, yes, my salary has increased severalfold. He hid his recent increment of 4 additional pounds a week. He intended to save up a small piggy bank for himself. After all, he couldn't just rely on the money in the unmarked account. Furthermore, mentioning that his salary had increased severalfold was enough to scare his siblings. 6 pounds? Melissa exclaimed in shock, finding it bizarre. I really need to change my job. Benson stroked his hairline. With the information Klein provided him, he had been putting a lot of effort into his studies. Without waiting for Klein to speak, Melissa said with a delighted expression, in that case, after deducting our normal expenses, you'll be able to save up enough money in 2 or 3 years to meet the standards of a marriageable gentleman. Well, it was Elizabeth who told me about the standards. Quote. Klein said at a loss, amused, that's something to be considered far into the future. Shouldn't we celebrate? I hereby announce that from today on, our staple food shall become white bread. After my workload decreases, we shall go try out delicacies from different restaurants. Melissa glanced at him, and, as though she did not hear what Klein had said, she said, Benson and I are attending Mass at the St. Selena Cathedral. Do you want to come? I am praising the goddess every day. Klein laughed. I need to catch up on sleep. He slept until 12:30 in the afternoon. After he had lunch with Benson and Melissa, he continued on with his mission of searching all the houses with red chimneys. When it was late at night, he sealed his room with spirituality and prepared to try the ritual for summoning spirit guide Daly's messenger. For Klein, setting up a simple ritual was as easy as breathing. Very soon, he was done preparing the ingredients, and he lit up the candle that represented himself. Looking at the flickering candlelight on the desk, Klein had an amusing thought for some baffling reason. Would this be considered holding a candlelight vigil in memory of myself? FK, what the hell am I thinking? He reined back his thoughts and picked up the black rotten flower powder that belonged to the domain of death and sprinkled it onto the candle. In return, he caught a whiff of a smell that was akin to formaldehyde from his previous life. Immediately after that, he dripped full moon essence oil, a favorite item of the Evernight. Amidst a sizzling crackle, his surroundings suddenly became quiet, and there was a shapeless, magical surge. Klein took a step back and softly recited in ancient Hermes, I. Then, he changed into Hermes, I summon in my name. The spirit that wanders about the unfounded, the higher dimensional creature that a human orders, the messenger that belongs to Daly Simone. Whoosh! The wind wailed and the dim candlelight was tainted with a blue luster. Under its illumination, the wall behind the desk produced translucent ripples, and a creepy face surfaced. Other than its mouth, it had no eyebrows, eyes, or nose. Its thick lips parted, and a long red tongue was extended. There were sharp, irregular teeth that lined its mouth. In addition, the tip of the tongue had 5 delicate fingers. They were constantly extending and retracting, as though they were waiting for a delivery. This is Daly's messenger? Compared to Mr. Azek's, it's just like a child. No, I can't accurately determine their differences. Yes, one is an adult giant, and the other is a human baby. I wonder if it's due to the magical item, or if it signifies Mr. Azek's strength. I have to re-evaluate my understanding of him. Perhaps he's a high-sequence Beyander. Crap, I forgot. In the letter, I should have asked Madame Daly for the names of the Sequence 4 and Sequence 3 corpse collector pathway. Mr. Azek most likely belongs to that pathway. Of course, he might have not advanced via potions. Yes, perhaps it's a gene that's passed down from his ancestors. I'll ask next time. The messenger is waiting. Klein looked at it seriously for a while and passed the neatly folded paper into the messenger's hand. Then, he watched as the hand gripped it tightly. Whoosh! The messenger retracted its tongue and swallowed the letter. The translucent, creepy, and wriggling face shrank back into the wall and disappeared. I've got to say, this magic is quite cool. Rather convenient too, but it can't be spread. Klein looked at the candlelight that had returned to normal. He shook his head and ended the ritual. Monday morning. Backland, Empress Borough. In a hidden corner of the municipal garden built by Duke Negan, Zio de Recha with her unkempt blonde hair and Furs Wall with her languid bearing were gawking at the liaison before them in a daze. They were momentarily at a loss at which language to use for a greeting. The petite Zio, who was slightly over 1.5 meters tall, looked at the golden retriever that had extended its tongue and was wagging its tail. She smoothed out her trainee night attire and weighed her words before she said, "Are you Miss Audrey's messenger?" Oh my goddess, why am I asking a dog so seriously? Furs was holding a thin cigarette with her fingers as she chuckled. Maybe it's a magical creature? I've never seen a magical creature that looks so much like a dog. Zio replied in all seriousness. Susie sat down and closed her mouth. She then pointed at her belly with her paw. There was a leather pouch tied around the dog's body amidst her long golden fur. Zio looked to her left and right, making sure that there was no one watching before she quickly moved closer. She bent down and removed the pouch. Furs watched curiously when her expression suddenly turned weird. It's made of crocodile skin, and it looks like the work of the fashion designer, Mr. Sades. She's actually using such a pouch for the transaction, in other words, it's very expensive? Zio raised the leather pouch. Furs pursed her lips tightly and nodded seriously. Zio instantly lowered her speed in an exaggerated manner. She carefully opened the zipper and took out the letter inside, as though she was carrying an antique vase in her hands. After she read it, she passed the letter to Furs. Furs burned it with her cigarette after reading it carefully. She watched as it turned into ashes and scattered onto the soil. There's no extra information provided. Zio pouted subconsciously. She took out a neatly folded paper from the pocket of her trainee night attire. She looked at Susie in an imposing manner and exhorted subconsciously, "This is the investigation report for the past few days. You must pass this on to Miss Audrey Hall directly." Susie quivered and sat up straight, her tail was wagging vigorously. Zio nodded in satisfaction, stuffed the stack of papers into the leather pouch, and tied it around Susie again. Susie howled and ran off very quickly. In the Hall family's luxurious villa, Audrey was sitting on the sofa of her own living room. She was holding a letter opener and was trying to open the letter before her. It was a letter sent by one of her brothers from the Balam Empire in the southern continent. There was a parcel that came along with the letter. At that moment, she saw Susie push open the half-closed door. The dog dashed over quickly. Susie sat on the carpet before Audrey and pawed at the leather pouch. "You really are an excellent messenger." Audrey wasn't stingy with her compliments. Susie looked back at the door. It induced vibrations in the air and said softly, "Your friend is very serious." When I saw her, she reminded me of the time when a hunter came to train us. She had been a complimentary gift when Count Hall bought hunting dogs. Susie, your Loan is getting more and more fluent. There are just a few problems with your logic in using the language. Audrey watched as her golden retriever took off the pouch on her own and skillfully pulled open the zipper. She gave Susie a look and immediately understood. She stood up and ran to lock the door. There's no result so far, but we found that some vagrants disappeared around the Backland Bridge Borough. Though, we can't know for sure that it was Kilongos. Perhaps the vagrants merely changed their movement patterns suddenly. Audrey flipped through the investigation report and seriously wondered how she should reply to Zio and Furs. I'll tell Zio that as long as she can track down Rear Admiral Hurricane, Kilongos, I'll buy the sheriff potion formula for her. No, that's not friendly enough. It would make her feel an inferiority complex. Yes, I shall say, Zio, I've prepared your reward. As long as you can complete the task, £450 will be yours. Sigh, as far as the main ingredients for the telepathous formula, I've only found the Farseman rabbit's spinal fluid. I still need the rainbow salamander's pituitary gland. Glaint, Zio, and Furs have yet to find it. Audrey, cheer up. At least you've digested the spectator potion completely. Once you put together all the ingredients, you'll become a Sequence 8 Beyander. Ellipsis. Audrey reined in her thoughts, picked up a pen and paper, and quickly wrote a reply. She stuffed it back into the leather pouch and entrusted Susie to make another trip. She watched her golden retriever as she opened the letter that her brother had sent. She read it with a smile. My dear sister, I think you should come to the southern continent too. Come over to the colonized regions of the Balam Empire. There's abundant sunlight, fresh air, a clean environment, freshly caught seafood, various unique cultures, and the very kind and obedient Balam people who make good servants, as well as the smell of freedom. On the contrary, Backland is cold and moist, the air is bad, there's always dust, and it's always gloomy. Plus, it's highly populated, which leads to all sorts of problems. And the endless balls, banquets, and salons. The social events are so boring and insipid that I wouldn't want to stay for a minute. Dear sister, I believe you share the same feeling. I'm not running away from home. I'm merely seeking my own place in life, but our brother definitely doesn't think so. He's always been a selfish person. Of course, he wouldn't be stingy with you, because you can only claim a tiny part of the family wealth, while I would be his biggest competition in the fight for the inheritance within the ranks of nobles. After all, our father is a duke who takes a long view. He definitely wouldn't be restrained by the rule that the eldest sibling will inherit the rank of nobility. As long as he feels that it's necessary, he would do anything. Just like when he sold off half the farmland and pastures to enter the banking industry, regardless of the strong opposition. I miss Backland sometimes, mostly father, mother, and you. I miss the smile that you put on my face during those few years. You must have become the most dazzling gem in Backland, but unfortunately, I'll only be able to return after 2 years. A career is a man's pride, while the outstanding young people in the Loan Kingdom treat the world as their stage. Ellipsis. You can tell our dear aunt that the coastal regions in the Balam Empire are very suitable for vacations, and especially suitable for her, given how her joints ache and swell in the winter. I sincerely invite her to be my guest. If you can come with her, that would be even better. Ellipsis. I didn't send you too many gifts. They're mainly things that are rich with the traditions and styles of Balam, such as the unique yellow silk, and the ornaments that are filled with traits related to the worship of death. I remembered that you loved things regarding mysticism, so I'll look around for you. The culture here is full of mystery. Ellipsis. After reading the letter, Audrey picked up a pen, paper, and writing board. She leaned back into the sofa, pursed her lips and wrote seriously, My dearest Alfred, although it has been less than a year, the little girl in your memories has grown up. I don't like mysticism anymore, so you don't have to search for those kinds of things. Because it's very dangerous. Audrey puffed up her cheeks and added in her head. She had heard of too many tragedies related to mysterious objects when participating in Beyander gatherings and from stories Zio and Furs recounted. She thought and declared excitedly, I'm now interested in biology. Recently, I've been in awe of the rainbow salamander. Can you ask around for me and find out where I can find one of these creatures, or if they have a complete corpse that has been preserved? Audrey stopped writing after she finished sharing some interesting news and scandals about aristocrats. She then adopted a serious pose as she recalled something. With her exceptional memory as a spectator, she arranged the information that she had received from her father's teachings, as well as the news she heard during banquets and salons, into paragraphs. After creating a draft in her head, Audrey penned, As for the political situation in Backland you asked about, it's not within my area of interest. I can describe it to you only based on my own impressions and the details that I happen to know. Some time ago, Father told me that after the abolishment of the Grain Act, the prices of crops were declining rapidly. The rent of farmland and pastures were also plunging, but I don't know the exact magnitude. I can only explain it to you with this example. As you know, Duke Negan is an aristocrat who owns the most land outside of the royal family. It's said that he owns more than £12 million worth of farmland, pastures, and forests. Last year, his land earned him a historic £1,300,000 in rent. But this year, it's forecast that his rent will only be £850,000, a whole £450,000 less. That's more than the entirety of the assets that I'm entitled to. Without any further explanation from me, I'm sure that my dear brother will understand the behavior of most old-fashioned nobles. They're proud of being landowners, and their income is derived mostly from rent. They place a heavy emphasis on their appearance and would maintain their current lifestyle even if they have to go into debt. They spend tens of thousands of pounds on the upkeep of their castles each year, many more thousands on clothes and jewelry, as well as their persistent hunting activities, social banquets, and the occasional lavish weddings and funerals, etc., etc. With the decrease in rent, according to my knowledge, a good portion of the nobles have met with financial difficulties. Because of this, Count Wolf has sold 84,000 ars of land in the countryside and gotten £29,000 in return. Viscount Conrad has also sold his art collection worth £55,000 to a national art gallery. Other than a few visionary nobles who had long shifted their focus to steel, coal, railroads, banks, and rubber industries, the rest of the nobles have been severely affected by the Grain Act. Let us praise our dear Count Hall. Father told me that the financial distress will loosen the control the nobles have over politics. As you can imagine, the number of ministers with blue blood will decline from the next year onward. In a bid to secure funding, the Conservative Party and the New Party have promised to confer upon anyone the noble titles as long as they donate a sufficient amount of money and lack any criminal records. Of course, the caveat is that the person who donated the money must own an amount of land befitting of a noble. One example is the rich Mr. Sindras. He purchased the lowest area of land expected of a baron, 60,000 ars, then donated £100,000 to the Carlton Club and £400,000 to the Conservative Party, and donations to charity amounting to £300,000. Finally, he succeeded in receiving conferment from His Majesty and became a highly regarded baron. I've heard that there's a price list to this, £300,000 to become a baron and £700,000 to £1 million for a hereditary baron. There is no clear price for the title of Viscount or Count, but I'm sure those are sufficiently ridiculous. Ellipsis. This year, many nobles who are facing financial difficulties are starting to seriously consider the possibility of marriages with wealthy merchants. There have already been 3 marriages like this over the last 2 months. The betrothal gifts the noble women received are something to be envied. Also, the workers who protested the Grain Act did experience a decrease in the cost of living, but the quality of their lives has not improved. Instead, it seems to have deteriorated as the bankrupt farmers have entered the city and stolen their jobs by requesting lower wages. Thus, the wages of the laborers are dropping rapidly. I remember the day when Father asked me who I felt was the winner of the Grain Act. My dear Alfred, you must know the answer. You would definitely be able to obtain a hereditary baron title through your own efforts. Ellipsis. Zio de Recha and Furs Wall were returning to the Backland Bridge Borough after they received Audrey's reply. Zio, with her messy blonde hair, was looking out the window of the carriage. Her eyes were bright like 2 burning balls of flame. She muttered the term, £450, to herself repeatedly, as if reciting an incantation. Her strength and courage grew every time she repeated the term. Darkholme hasn't reported the status of the investigation today. Let's make a trip to his house. Zio suddenly turned to look at Furs. Darkholme was the leader of a triad in the Backland East Borough and had control over many beggars and thieves. Even though he looked very friendly with his chubby face that was perpetually adorned with a warm and amiable smile, Zio knew that he was a merciless scoundrel. He once broke the arm of a 13-year-old thief because the boy had hidden his profit. Unless it was necessary, Zio was unwilling to meet Darkholme, but Darkholme was one of the few people who were most familiar with the vagrants in the city. Furs pushed her slightly curly hair back behind her ear. As long as it doesn't delay my lunch. No problem. Perhaps I could treat you to an Intis feast after this week. Zio promised in complacency. Must I thank God? Furs asked as she laughed. Unlike Zio, Furs was a moderate believer of the god of steam and machinery. As they conversed, the 2 ladies switched to another public carriage and arrived at the Backland East Borough, and arrived at Darkholme's house. It was a terrace house located in a narrow alley. There were green plants hanging from the walls, the exterior looked relatively unkempt. Zio walked to the door, raised her right hand and knocked in a unique rhythm. The unlocked door opened with a creak following her knocks. Zio's apparently confused expression immediately turned stern, like a wary lion's. She took out a bayonet she carried with her and cautiously pushed open the door. She then slowly stepped inside. Furs also stopped looking nonchalant, having produced a dagger of unknown origins. They didn't smell any peculiar scents, but their rich experience told them that something was off. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Zio and Furs entered Darkholm's house. Then they saw a pale limb on a gas lamp, internal organs on a coffee table, as well as strips upon strips of flesh strewn on the floor and hung on the clothes rack. Pieces of bone had been stripped clean and piled up near the door. And amongst the bones was a head, its vacant eyes open. It was none other than Darkholm. His chubby face still maintained the amiable smile, as if everything was normal. Furthermore, there was no stench of blood in the house. As a former clinical doctor before becoming a best-selling author and Sequence 9 Beyander, Furs has seen many death scenes more disgusting than this. She patted the tense Zio, who was on the brink of vomiting, as she surveyed the surroundings. Kilongos? Rear Admiral Hurricane Kilongos? He realized that Darkholm was investigating the missing vagrants and tracked him back to his house? Or could it be said that Darkholm had tracked him down, but ended up being caught? Zio fought back the urge to retch and said with a serious expression, "He sure lives up to his name as a merciless and crafty pirate admiral." The strangeness here also fits the description of his treasure. Crafty. Furs was suddenly alarmed as she blurted out, could he be waiting nearby in an ambush against the mastermind behind the investigations? Zio froze for a moment before answering in a fluster, that's highly likely. He was a Sequence 6 Wind-blessed, a powerful pirate with a mystical artifact, while they were just 2 Sequence 9s. This was an extremely simple and easy contrast. Ellipsis. In the house opposite Darkholm's house, a man with a unique broad chin and dark green eyes in his 30s was standing by the window, coldly observing Zio's and Furs's opening of the door and slow entry. He was none other than Rear Admiral Hurricane Kilongos. The black glove on his left hand twitched as if it were alive. A layer of dull gold scales appeared on its surface. Kilongos revealed a cruel and joyous expression as his dark green eyes turned pale gold and indifferent. Ellipsis. The moment Furs realized this, she dragged Zio to the other side and avoided the area just across the main door. She then gritted her pearly white teeth and took out a bracelet that was hidden by her sleeves. This silver bracelet had 3 dark green, coarse stones which showed signs of burn marks and were rough and uneven. Furs pulled out one of the stones and let out a low growl in Ancient Hermes' door. She grabbed onto Zio de Recha tightly as the stone released a faint blue glow. The figures of the 2 ladies turned indistinct, nearly invisible. They saw many forms they found difficult to describe. There were even transparent objects that didn't seem to exist. They saw different colors, lustrous splendors which seemed to possess immense knowledge. They had entered the mysterious spirit world. In this strange world that stood distinct from reality, Furs proceeded in a particular direction while pulling Zio along. Seconds later, they exited their indistinct states and returned to reality, to Backland. But they were no longer at Darkholm's house, but instead arrived at an empty cemetery. Kilongos, who was wearing his scaled glove, silently appeared at the door of Darkholm's house. He swept the interior with his cold gaze. He froze for a moment, then creased his brows as he muttered to himself, "Traveler? In the cemetery. What are we going to do next?" Furs panted, sensing their predicament and feeling a lingering sense of fear. The bracelet was a mystical item she had received along with the formula for Apprentice and its corresponding materials back during a fortuitous encounter of hers. Other than causing her to hear strange, faint murmurings during the full moon every month, it posed no threat. There were originally 5 stones on the bracelet, each stone allowing her to traverse through the spirit world, technically allowing her to teleport. But now, there were only 2 stones left. Zio calmed herself down and nodded solemnly. "First notify Miss Audrey, then we call the police." "Call the police?" Furs Wall repeated in surprise. To Beyonders, lodging a police report seemed to be something of another world. Zio paced back and forth as she tugged her coarse blonde hair. The scene of Darkholm's death is harrowing and creepy. As long as the police aren't blind, they would definitely pass the case on to the mandated punishers, the Nighthawks, the Machinery Hivemind, or the Special Department of the military. When that happens, we can leak some more information and let them know that the murderer is Kilongos. At that point, the entire city will be chasing after him. Our goal is only to look for Kilongos, not to capture him. With the help of so many Beyonders, things would become much simpler and safer. Once Kilongos panics and makes a mistake, it would be our chance to claim our bounty. Heh heh, I'm referring to the discovery of his whereabouts. Zio laughed dryly and looked at the appalled Furs. Do you think that the only way I know to deal with problems is by charging into them headfirst? The difference between us and Kilongos is as vast as the Daisy Bay. Furs nodded slowly and said, your understanding of yourself is absolutely right. You've done too many things of a similar nature. Hence, the losses that you've suffered is sufficient for you to advance to Sequence 8. Luckily, you're still rational enough regarding this matter. Zio lowered her head to look at her bayonet. She thought for a moment and said, I have to be honest. I clearly sensed the approach of death earlier. Kilongos was no doubt nearby. That was an aura evil enough to destroy us at any time. That triggered an instinctual response in me. Furs wore her silver bracelet that had 2 stones left and thought seriously. I agree with your idea. Let's inform Miss Audrey first and lodge the police report after. Yes, regardless if it was Darkholme or his underlings who found Kilongos's traces, we could continue to investigate with that approach and find out Kilongos's activity range and the location of his residence. Zio creased her slim blonde eyebrows and said, but Kilongos would definitely not remain in the same place. Even as one of the 7 pirate admirals, even if he had the assistance of a mystical artifact, Kilongos had to be extremely careful in Backland. Even Nast, the king of the 5 seas, had once encountered disaster here and was nearly caught. No, what I meant was, to surmise or confirm the purpose of Kilongos's visit to Backland based on the clues. Once we know what he's trying to do, no matter how he disguises himself or what tricks he pulls, he'll be exposed to us in the end. Then, our mission would be accomplished, Furs explained in detail. 2 years of novel writing experience tells me that things would become simple once we grasp the crux of the matter. Zio looked at her best friend in shock. She couldn't believe the woman had just made such a logical statement. I'm different from you. I'm merely too lazy to think, while you think with your muscles. Furs pursed her lips, leaned her head sideways, and smiled. Teasing me doesn't make you smarter. Zio tried to smooth out her few strands of blonde hair that was sticking out. All right, let's head over to Empress Burrow and tell Miss Audrey about this. Furs nodded faintly and said, so, what's our emergency contact method with Miss Audrey? Zio was momentarily put at a loss. She looked afar at the tombstone as she said, she told me that pet dog of hers we saw earlier walks herself at least 5 times a day. Well, the next walk should be after lunch. In other words, we have to loiter around suspiciously outside Count Hall's luxurious manor? The corner of Furs's lips twitched. Zio suddenly looked sideways and revealed an obsequious smile. Furs, or would you prefer to just sneak in? I don't think that would be difficult for you. It's what you're good at. A hereditary count for centuries, one of the most influential parliament members in the House of Lords, the largest shareholder of Varvat Bank, the 4th largest shareholder of Backland Bank, the special consultant of the Royal Bank of Loan, the 3rd largest shareholder of Suchit Bank in the Intis Republic, the 2nd largest shareholder of Constant Coal and Steel Consortium, and so on. These are the titles of Miss Audrey's father. Zio, use your brain. How could a man like that not employ any beyonders? Would he not have any prized collections? This is different from those destitute viscounts and barons. Furs replied in exasperation. I swear in the name of God, if I were to sneak in, I would be discovered and caught within 5 minutes. Zio nodded continuously in agreement. Let's wait for the golden retriever then. With that said, she led the way. After she took a few steps forward, she spoke with her back facing Furs. Well, I will compensate you for your losses and the damages in the future. I'm referring to the stone, of course. Listening to that, the corner of Furs's lips lifted and she said, I was saving myself. And, Zio, you're going the wrong way. God, if you were an apprentice and ended up becoming a traveler in the future, it would be a disaster. Outside Count Hall's luxurious manor, Zio and Furs hid behind an Intis parasol tree and secretly observed their target building in silence, watching the people walking to and fro. After God knows how long, they finally saw the golden retriever come out from a hidden hole under the wall. It pricked up its ears and looked to its left and right, appearing very cautious. Just as Susie started taking its walk happily, a black male dog popped up from nowhere. It fawned on Susie and started running around in circles. This is the first time I'm seeing a dog show such a human-like reaction. Just how much does it hate that black dog? Zio sighed. She could tell from Susie's gaze and facial expression that there was obvious detest. Furs smiled and said, it's just like encountering a rash, disgusting, and persistent lecher. Seeing Susie attempt to speed up to escape the black dog's pursuit, Zio stood up. Do administer justice. My ruling is for you to leave her alone. Zio shouted with a mask of solemnity. The black dog was taken aback and immediately scampered away with its tail between its legs. Susie let out a breath of relief and slowed down. It barked politely and wagged its tail. That was close. I nearly said, thank you, to them. The golden retriever thought in joy. That would have been a very awkward situation. A melodic tune slowly came to a halt as Audrey picked up the latest intelligence Zio and Furs had delivered and read it with knitted brows. She closed the piano cover and stood up elegantly. She paced back and forth in her piano room and considered her next course of action. Kilongos is a very dangerous man. If Zio and Furs continued investigating, they might end up in danger. It might even expose me. Yes, I should just proceed according to their suggestion. Oh yeah, it's another 2 hours until the Tarot Club. I wonder what Mr. Fool would suggest. If he's still not interested, I'll discuss it with the Hanged Man carefully. Audrey gradually calmed herself down. This was the first time she had encountered, or perhaps was described as being placed in such a perilous situation. There was already one death. 3 in the afternoon. Audrey's vision recovered from a crimson and blurry state before seeing the boundless grey fog that didn't belong to reality, the lofty palace that looked like the home of a giant, the long ancient mottled bronze table, and the fool who was always engulfed by a thick layer of fog. Lastly, she saw the Hanged Man and the sun. At that moment, Audrey's tense and anxious emotions seemed to relax. She felt so safe, so calm. I'm participating in the Tarot Club that doesn't belong in the material world, and I'm dealing with Mr. Fool who's nearly a god. Kilongos and I are on different levels. Audrey sat in an upright position proudly. She lifted her chin slightly and greeted cheerfully, Good afternoon, Mr. Fool. Good afternoon, Mr. Hanged Man. Good afternoon, Mr. Sun. After they greeted one another, Klein saw that Miss Justice was indicating her desire to speak. Therefore, he nodded faintly to express his permission. Honorable Mr. Fool, I wonder if your adorer has received the compensation of £300? Audrey asked, holding back her urge to talk about Kilongos while she showed concern over her leader's adorer. Klein smiled and said, I didn't pay close attention to this matter. But as my adorer didn't request for additional help, I suppose he has already received it. Yes, I've checked multiple times. There are £300 lying in my anonymous bank account. Klein added in his head happily. That's great. Audrey relaxed and looked across her. Mr. Hanged Man, there's been progress regarding Kilongos. Alger suddenly sat up straight. He couldn't hide his excitement as he asked, where is he? Unfortunately, he noticed our investigations just after we discovered his tracks. He killed one of the personnel involved. Audrey repeated the highlights of Zio's and Furz's story and explained their follow-up plan in detail. Alger nodded faintly and said, I'll pay close attention. Then, he turned to the side and looked towards the seat of honor at the long bronze table. Under the vacant gaze of the sun, Derek, who listened but didn't understand anything, he said, Honorable Mr. Fool, if I were to find out Kilongos' true intention and the very important and magical item that he intends to obtain, please allow me to recite your name and inform you through the ritual. He didn't repeat his request for the fool's adorer to provide him assistance. As he brought it up before and the fool had given his answer, there was no need to harp on the topic. Otherwise, it might provoke the god. Hence, Alger made it clear that his intention was only to report his findings. If the final temptation was sufficient, he believed that Mr. Fool's adorer would definitely appear. That works? Audrey widened her eyes. I should have asked for the right to report as well. I might be able to gain Mr. Fool's guidance occasionally. She thought with regret. Under everyone's gaze, Klein leaned back into his chair and nodded faintly. He replied slowly, You may. Alger heaved a sigh of relief when he heard the fool's answer. He lowered his head and humbly said, Please allow me to thank you in advance. That's because I'm also curious about the item Kilongos is searching for. I want to know about the item that can allow a Sequence 6 wind blessed to have the strength of a Sequence 4. I'm also curious about what a pirate admiral is going to do in Backlund. Klein smiled, maintaining his profound posture. It's not like I've promised to provide assistance after I hear your prayers. He emphasized in his heart. But now, he was a lot more confident than before. Now, he had actual allies and the mysterious Mr. Azek who was currently in Backlund. If it was absolutely necessary, Klein was willing to use the bronze whistle to enlist the help of Azek. Of course, he definitely wouldn't mention the Tarot Club. He would probably say he got information from some random source. There were still two problems that existed in this matter. First, Klein was only limited to a cooperative relationship with ASIC. It wasn't necessarily the case that ASIC would provide assistance unless he was interested in what Kilongos was doing or the mystical item that he was after. Second, Klein was unsure of just how powerful ASIC was. Even if he had made the assumption that ASIC was a high-sequence Beyonder, he had to consider the fact that his memory loss might have weakened his abilities. After all, knowledge was usually equated with power, and the lack of knowledge would definitely diminish ASIC's power. If that was the case, Klein couldn't guarantee that ASIC could deal with Kilongos, especially with the latter wielding the creeping hunger. Klein was afraid that he would be placing ASIC in danger, so he was unwilling to trouble ASIC unless he absolutely had to. Now that I think about it, Mr. ASIC's terrifying messenger can be summoned with the bronze whistle. No, that thing doesn't look like a messenger at all. It could take the role of an evil boss. So, even if Mr. ASIC cannot beat the creeping hunger augmented Kilongos, he should be able to defend himself easily and have enough power left to save the Hanged Man, Miss Justice, and her partners. Klein shifted his posture as he thought, still leaning against the back of his chair. He propped his right leg over his left. The Hanged Man Alger looked at the fool and spoke once again. I'm about to receive a batch of pages from Emperor Russell's diary. I believe that I can present them to you in the next gathering, or the gathering after that. According to the arrangement of the Church of the Lord of Storms, Pritz Harbor was under the jurisdiction of the Backland Diocese. Thus, Alger could enter the capital and wait for Rear Admiral Hurricane Kilongos to show himself under the guise of reporting about his previous voyage. Backland had been the headquarters of the Church of the Lord of Storms until the end of the last epoch, having shifted their holy altar to Passu Island only after the establishment of the Loan Kingdom. Regardless, the status of the Church of the Lord of Storms in Backland was second only to the headquarters of the seven great churches. One could imagine the information the Church of the Lord of Storms held. Under these circumstances, Alger was confident that he would be able to collect pages of Emperor Russell's diary in the name of research. After all, they were indecipherable at present. Klein allowed joy to color his tone, as he said with a gentle nod, "Very good." What he was really feeling right now was a mix of joy and worry. He was happy that he could see several pages of Emperor Russell's diary soon. They might contain a lot of useful information, but he was also worried about what he had to give the Hanged Man in return. After all, no one knew if the Hanged Man would be interested in the contents of the diary, or if the content was valuable enough. Even a seer is unable to determine that in advance. Must I really let my adorer help him? Klein gave a silent sigh. Audrey Hall hurriedly spoke up when she saw the conversation between the Hanged Man and the Fool end. Honorable Mr. Fool, may I recite your name and inform you using a ritual should I receive any timely and useful information? Timely. Look, Miss Justice's choice of words is so refined. Compared to her, you are too vulgar, the Hanged Man. Klein nodded slightly, saying past the fog, you may. Great. Audrey secretly clenched her fists. At the same time, Klein turned to look at the son, Derek Berg, who had been silently listening to their conversations. He spoke, his tone was peaceful. The same goes for you as well. Yes, Mr. Fool. Derek lowered his head. The majestic palace was silent for a few seconds before Audrey spoke. I need the complete pituitary gland of a rainbow salamander. One of the main ingredients of the telepathous potion? Hanged Man Alger nodded slightly as if he was contemplating. I don't have it. To be honest, I've only seen this creature in textbooks. The son, Derek, heard the term automatically translated to him as Phantom Netherdrake. What kind of textbook would discuss a supernatural creature? How envious. I can only get information like that at a Beyonder gathering, through word of mouth, or through a crumpled piece of paper. There's no system in place, and my search for knowledge lacks organization. I'll find a way to trade for the son's textbook in the future. Oh, he was interested in the formula for the Bard potion. Audrey thought, a little envious. At that moment, Alger looked at the fool, then retracted his gaze. He then looked opposite him and said in thought, I might have a way of obtaining the complete pituitary gland of the rainbow salamander. Without waiting for Audrey to speak, he added on, but it's under the premise that Kilongos is found. When the time comes, the complete pituitary gland of the rainbow salamander would be equivalent to the extra compensation that I owe you. Miss Justice, you might not know, but these creatures are nearly extinct, and we can only find traces of them in primitive islands in the Sea of Fog, the Berserk Sea, or the Sonia Sea. Not many people have the coordinates to these islands. Hey, if you're interested, we can make a deal, for I am one of the few who knows how to get there. I'm also interested in those primitive islands. Klein silently listened to their conversation. Thinking about the extinction of the rainbow salamander, he suddenly recalled the joke he cracked with old Neil, the Dragons and Giants Protection Association. He let out a sigh in his heart. Audrey became thrilled after hearing that. She fought back her emotions as she said, I once dreamed of going on a voyage in search of these primitive islands to take in the history. My goddess, the Tarot Club is too powerful, too wonderful. To be able to recruit a member who has the coordinates of the primitive islands. Praise Mr. Fool. Audrey couldn't maintain her spectator state as a smile crept across her face. Primitive islands? Klein froze for a moment, then thought about a page of Emperor Rassel's diary that he had seen, the one where the emperor described himself as a pirate king. He said that he discovered an unnamed island with many supernatural creatures when he and his 4 horsemen of the apocalypse were traversing the Sea of Fog on an unsafe sea route. Could that be the so-called primitive island? How unfortunate, the great emperor didn't include any coordinates in his diary. Perhaps the information will be in some future pages, but as of now, I haven't received any pages of his diary in chronological order. Klein was filled with regret and anticipation. The son Derek was already confused by the terms, Sea of Fog, Berserk Sea, Sonia Sea, Primitive Island, etc. He felt more and more certain that Miss Justice and Mr. Hanged Man belonged to a different world than he did. After collecting herself for a few seconds, Audrey asked curiously, does the near extinction of the rainbow salamander mean that the spectator pathway will be severed soon? No, there will definitely be substitute materials. Alger gave a definite answer. What substitute materials are there? Audrey's eyes brightened as she asked. Alger shook his head, replying without revealing certain profound truths, I don't know. Perhaps the members of the psychology alchemists might know. Then how can you be so sure that there will be substitute ingredients? Audrey didn't understand. Alger laughed and said, you will understand in time. Or do you have something to trade for the information right now? I guess I'll wait. Audrey pouted and sighed. She also dismissed the idea of asking Mr. Fool. There's no use in me knowing for the time being. The Hanged Man will definitely ask about something regarding Rear Admiral Hurricane, and I cannot be dragged too deep into that matter. She suddenly felt like praising her intellect. But what she never expected was that Mr. Fool was feeling very disappointed at that moment. Klein was rather curious about the secrets which Alger's words held. Unfortunately, Miss Justice, who was the best assist all this while, didn't choose to go through with the transaction. No matter what method they chose to perform a transaction, the contents of the deal couldn't be hidden from the owner of the fog. Well, even if the rainbow salamander is nearing extinction, the psychology alchemists are still giving out formulas listing it as an ingredient instead of providing a substitute. Does this mean that the psychology alchemists are in possession of the coordinates of certain primitive islands? Or could they be working together with an organization that has the coordinates? Klein wondered. After the end of the transaction discussions, Klein looked around, then turned to the sun. He asked in a gentle tone, does the City of Silver still believe in gods? Klein was merely an official member of the Nighthawks and had no access to deeper mysticism knowledge. An example would be sacrificial rituals. Thus, in order to refine his understanding of performing sacrificing dedicated to himself, to move materials in the mysterious space above the gray fog, as a sequence 8, Klein needed to learn it as soon as possible from other sources. He came up with 3 methods after continuous consideration. First, he was going to ask Spirit Guide Daly, who was adept at ritualistic magic whilst also being a deacon. But this might invite suspicion from her. Thus, Klein could only patiently wait for an opportunity. Second, he could ask Mr. Azek, but Klein couldn't guarantee that he would be able to recall the knowledge in this area. Third, he was going to use a roundabout way to ask Sun, who lived in the City of Silver. Klein already had an idea of how he was going to do it while effectively maintaining his image. Whatever he asked would be tied to the gods. Derek replied in a respectful tone, we still believe in the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God. Upon hearing the fool's question, Audrey perked up her ears and entered her spectator state. She waited for the sun to answer. She had always been curious about where the City of Silver was and what was so special about that place, but she couldn't bring herself to ask. It touched upon his privacy after all. At that moment, Mr. Fool was asking personally. It was like finishing the first volume of an outstanding detective novel she had been reading for a long time, and she finally had the chance to buy the next volume. The Sun's answer didn't disappoint her. They didn't believe in the mainstream 7 Orthodox deities, nor did they believe in death as the southern continent did. They also didn't believe in the hidden existences, evil gods or devils, primordial demoness, hidden sage, dark side of the universe, chained god, or the true creator, which the Hanged Man had told her before. The City of Silver is really special. They actually worship the creator himself. This is the primordial worship that Mr. Hanged Man described, right? The description of omnipotence is a little strange. Audrey stole a glance at the Hanged Man subconsciously and realized that he was nodding slightly. Klein wasn't surprised at all. He purposely chuckled and asked in reply, even though he abandoned you? Abandoned? The creator abandoned the City of Silver? Alger was shocked. Suddenly when he suddenly made the connection regarding a particular term. The Forsaken Land of the Gods. In the confidential information of the Church of the Lord of Storms, at the security clearance level that Alger, who was captain, equivalent to the bishop level, could access, the Forsaken Land of the Gods had always only been a name with no actual description. However, it clearly pointed towards the end of the Sonia Sea. From what he knew, even the cardinals at the core of the church had no idea what the Forsaken Land of the Gods represented. But only the leader of the church, the proxy of the Lord of Storms, knew something about the situation and seemed to be taking charge of the hidden mission to look for the Forsaken Land of the Gods. Alger had once made a bold guess when he equated the true creator's holy residence, which was promoted by the Aurora Order, with the Forsaken Land of the Gods. But, unfortunately, the fool hadn't confirmed his guess, so he couldn't be sure. Now, he was shocked and surprised to find that the Tarot Club member using the sun as his codename was very likely from the Forsaken Land of the Gods. Mr. Fool knew where the Forsaken Land of the Gods was all this time, and he could pull someone from there to be a member of the gathering. This is a hidden place that the Church of the Lord of Storms has been trying to find to no avail. Alger looked at the fool who was seated in the seat of honor at the end of the ancient long bronze table in horror. He could only see that he was leaning back in his chair in silence, engulfed by the thick fog. Audrey wasn't particularly moved about it. The only time that she had heard about the Forsaken Land of the Gods was from the Hanged Man's question. She wasn't particularly interested, so she failed to associate it to anything from what Mr. Fool said earlier. The City of Silver has the legend about being abandoned by the creator. Mr. Hanged Man seems to be deeply affected. What is he amazed and afraid of? Audrey nodded in puzzlement as she remembered the details of the moment. Yes, we believe that we will regain the Lord's favor in the end. Perhaps it will be on the day the sun rises again, Derek Berg answered in an uncertain tone. We were once ruled by the giant's royal family, and we worshipped the giant King Ormir. Later, we were saved by the Lord and we will never betray the Lord again. Ruled by the giant's royal family. It really is ancient, but it doesn't seem to match. Alger, who had guessed at something, suddenly recalled the description about the second epic in the hidden chapter of the Book of Storms. The second epic was also known as humanity's dark epic. At the time, the sky, ocean, and land were ruled over by dragons, giants, elves, mutants, devils, phoenixes, demonic wolves, and dead spirits. But in the end, the Lord of Storms, eternal blazing sun, and the God of knowledge and wisdom led humanity into defeating the supernatural creatures and ushered in the beginning of the third epic, the Glorious Era, which was later known as Cataclysm. Giant King Ormir. Klein repeated the name in silence. In various legends and myths, it was a great existence on par with the deities. Even now, there were still some places that worshipped him. Even the most famous and most expensive grape wine in the Intis Republic was named after Ormir. It was said that the giant king particularly fancied grape wine which was like blood. Considering the fact that the Church of the God of Combat is in control of the complete pathway of the warrior, which once belonged to the giants, can I assume that Ormir was the ancient god of combat? Klein guessed. He nodded deliberately but didn't think any further about it. He then asked calmly, do you still offer sacrifices to this omnipotent god? Yes, we still do. But since the day we were abandoned, we have never gotten any response. Derek's voice had a hint of unconcealed pain. Klein leaned against the back of his chair leisurely. He half closed his eyes and said, describe the process of your offering ritual in detail. Does Mr. Fool want to figure out the truth behind the City of Silver's abandonment? Or does he want to determine if the creator still exists? Alger suddenly felt a shock through his body and he quivered. Not only was he afraid, but he was also excited too. This was because he felt he was being made privy to the secrets between deities. That made him feel like he had been elevated to a whole new level. I've been chasing after power, after strength. Didn't I do it to achieve this kind of feeling? Alger leaned back, lifted his chin, and got carried away with his thoughts. Mr. Hanged Man's mental state doesn't seem to be normal. Audrey looked at him with pity. She finally understood that there might be some sort of shocking secret behind the communication between Mr. Fool and the Sun, which led to the Hanged Man's loss of composure. After the Kilongos commission is over, I'll pay the price to get information about what Mr. Hanged Man learned today. I wonder if he would be willing to. Audrey thought in anticipation, yet was still a little worried. Derek didn't notice the weight that was hanging on his answer as he replied frankly, "We build opulent altars covered in the Lord's symbol. Every time we receive a bumper black-faced grass harvest, we hold a sacrificial ritual. We use the monsters we capture in the depths of the darkness to use as sacrificial offerings. After we recite God's honorable title and the necessary prayers, we dance for him and then kill the monsters, to let their spirituality and tainted blood dye the entire altar. If we haven't caught any monsters, then we use a sinner on the lowest floor in the City of Silver prison instead. Then, we turn the very first batch of black-faced grass into food and serve it before the Lord. In the end, we sing praises in unison and end the ritual. Since I was planning to offer a sacrifice to myself, I'm not picky about time, and the altar can be as simple as possible. The most important part would be to open a channel with the aid of the monster's spirituality or the blood containing Beyonder powers to complete the sacrifice offering. Of course, this is under the premise that one will receive a response? How extravagant! Klein used his mysticism knowledge to analyze every step of the sacrificial ritual in the City of Silver before finally saying, "What are the corresponding prayers? What language do you recite them in?" Derek was also looking forward to this, so as to gain hints from Mr. Fool on how to shake off the curse, so he recalled it carefully and answered, "We use Jotun, which is also our common language. The corresponding prayers are, your devoted believers pray for your attention. We pray for you to take their offerings. We pray for you to open the gates to your kingdom." Klein listened in silence and intentionally let the engulfing fog slowly swirl around him. He nodded as though deep in thought and remained silent. As for what he learned from it, he obviously wouldn't share it. Alger found it very normal. How could the secrets of a deity be revealed directly to a mortal? Derek also steeled his resolve to quickly grow in power, so that he could obtain something that could garner Mr. Fool's interest in exchange for his guidance. After some more communication, Klein ended the gathering. He watched Justice's, the Hanged Man's, and the Sun's figures vanish before him. He looked down and saw the boundless gray fog and crimson stars that seemed eternally immutable. However, after he advanced to sequence 8, he realized that he could connect even more stars. In other words, he could pull in more members. At least 2. Klein nodded indiscernibly. He wasn't in a hurry to add new members. He planned to act as he had before. He would first wait and observe. If Justice and the Hanged Man had any recommendations, he could assess them first. What I saw the last few times was when the Sun was praying. There was a clear crystal ball before him, but ever since I pulled him into the world above the gray fog, that crystal ball has never appeared again. Does the prerequisite needed to pull people in through the connection of the Crimson Star have something to do with having a special item around them? Or does every Crimson Star correspond to an item in reality, which, when it's connected successfully, it would return to the world above the gray fog? I wonder if Miss Justice and Mr. Hanged Man were the same. Let's just assume that's the case. In that case, if people without this special item were to recite, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck," and allow me to hear their prayers, would I be able to pull them in? I can give it a try in the future. Klein didn't stay any longer. He wrapped himself with spirituality and stimulated a descent, leaving behind the lofty palace, the ancient table, and the 22 high-back chairs which sat immutably above the gray fog. He had mastered the overflowing power of the clown potion and eliminated the corresponding negative effects. Therefore, he wanted to try the ritual to summon himself. I wonder what I'll conjure this time. Klein thought in anticipation and fear as he fell through the mad ravings. Report Chapter